Hey guys, tonight we are not going to be racing chariots in the hippodrome or debating philosophy with Socrates on the Acropolis. No, tonight we're doing something truly special. We are taking a slow, meandering stroll through one of the most famous and perhaps boring places in all of antiquity, the Great Library of Alexandria. Imagine, if you will, the gentle hush of thousands of scrolls, the scent of old papyrus and cedar oil filling the air, the soft glow of a single oil lamp illuminating an ancient text you can't even read. It's a place of quiet contemplation and dusty knowledge, a place so incredibly significant that its mere name still echoes through history. We will be traversing dusty shelves and unrolling brittle manuscripts, a journey so packed with tedious facts and obscure details that you probably won't even survive the first section without dozing off. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your feet glide silently across the cool marble floor. It's a vast, cavernous space, a true testament to the intellectual ambition of the Ptolemaic dynasty that founded it. You squint, trying to make out the rows upon rows of shelves that stretch into the dim distance. There are no books here, not as you know them. Instead, you see countless cubbyholes, each one holding a rolled-up papyrus scroll. The air itself feels thick with the weight of knowledge, a silent hum of centuries of thought contained within these walls. This isn't a place of grand pronouncements, but of quiet industry. You see a scholar carefully unrolling a scroll, his fingers gentle, almost reverent, as he reads. You notice another diligently copying a text, his stylus scratching softly on a fresh sheet of papyrus. This place, in its prime, was a true wonder of the ancient world. It wasn't just a building, it was an idea. Historians still argue whether the library was a single, massive complex or a collection of different buildings scattered throughout the city. But what's not up for debate is its purpose, to collect all the knowledge in the world. Think about that for a second. All the knowledge. The sheer arrogance of it is almost charming. The first Ptolemy, a general of Alexander the Great, decided he wanted his new city of Alexandria to be the intellectual heart of the world, and he wasn't going to let something as minor as not having all the books stop him. So, the Library of Alexandria was born. It was part of a larger research complex known as the Mauseon, or Shrine of the Muses. This wasn't just a place to hold books, it was an ancient think tank, a pre-internet version of Google's headquarters combined with a prestigious university. Scholars lived here, their lodging and meals paid for by the king, all in service of a single goal: to read, to copy, and to create. You can almost smell the roasting meat from the communal dining hall and hear the low murmurs of intellectual debate coming from a nearby chamber. It's a different kind of bustle than you're used to, a mental energy rather than a physical one. They were trying to do something no one had ever attempted before, and let's be real, you'd be a little intimidated too if your job was to get all the books. As you drift past a shelf, you notice a small, peculiar detail, a tiny, almost hidden mark on the side of a papyrus roll. It's a stamp, a seal. You lean in closer. It seems to be a tiny, stylized version of a ship. This, you later learn, was a unique marker for a scroll that had been borrowed from a visiting ship. The library had a policy of seizing all books found on ships that docked in Alexandria. They would copy the texts, sometimes very hastily, and return the copies to the ship's captain while keeping the originals. It's a bizarre and slightly thuggish way to build a collection, but it worked. The library swelled to hundreds of thousands of scrolls, an unimaginable hoard of knowledge for the time. You can picture the hapless sailor trying to argue with a royal official. But sir, that's my grandpa's favourite epic poem, only to be told. Sorry, buddy, the king wants it. You wonder if they ever got their good copies back, or if the library just gave them a quick, messy copy and sent them on their way. Your tour continues, your footsteps muffled by the soft carpet of dust that has settled over centuries. You now find yourself in a different wing, and the air here smells faintly of salt and sweat, an odd mix with the cedar and papyrus. You see a grand stone door, its carvings depicting a ship sailing into a harbour. Its cargo not grain or spices, but stacks of scrolls. This is where the notorious book acquisition policy was carried out. Remember that cheeky detail from a moment ago about them stealing books off ships? Well, It gets even weirder, and a bit more official. This wasn't just a side hustle. It was a cornerstone of the library's growth. Ptolemy Sota, the one who started all this, issued a formal decree stating that any ship that docked in Alexandria with books on board had to hand them over to the library. Think of it as ancient customs. But for intellectual property, the scrolls would be taken to the copyists, who would work at a furious pace to create a duplicate. Once finished, the sailors would get a brand new copy, and the library would keep the usually more valuable original. It was an ingenious, if slightly unethical, way to build the world's most extensive library, one stolen scroll at a time. The irony is, for all the talk of enlightened scholarship and the pursuit of knowledge, the very foundation of this institution was built on a legal form of piracy. You can almost hear the muffled arguments echoing through the corridor, a grizzled merchant captain, tired from a long voyage, trying to explain that the papyrus roll in his bag is just a personal journal and not some long-lost epic poem. The library's officials, of course, would have none of it. A scroll is a scroll, you imagine one of them saying, and the king wants to read it. Now hand it over, please, and we'll have a less smudged copy for you in a week. You have to admire the efficiency, even if it feels a little bit like intellectual extortion. This mainstream historical fact that the Ptolemies were aggressive collectors is what allowed the library to grow so rapidly. The spoils from this policy were known as ship books, and they made up a significant portion of the library's collection. You notice a small, off-center carving on the wall that depicts a book scroll with a tiny, almost cartoonish bird perched on top of it. This, a guide whispers in your ear, is a reference to an even stranger library tradition. The scholars, in their relentless pursuit of completeness, would often purchase scrolls from private citizens. However, there was a catch. They believed that some scrolls, especially those with unique or rare texts, had a sort of spirit or soul that could be damaged if not properly handled. So, when they purchased a particularly valuable scroll, they would sometimes perform a small, almost superstitious ritual over it. This involved wafting incense over the scroll and whispering a short incantation to appease its spirit. It's a small, quirky tidbit that reminds you that even the most rigorous scientific minds of the ancient world had their own blend of logic and superstition. The bird carving, it said, represents the freed spirit of the scroll. Now at home in the hallowed halls of the Mausion, historians still argue whether the library's collection reached a staggering number of 500,000 scrolls or a more conservative 50,000. The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle, but the sheer scale of the institution is what matters. Imagine the logistical nightmare of cataloguing, storing, and preserving that much information in a time before printing presses, climate control, or even a standardized alphabet. You're walking through a monument to human ambition, yes, but also a testament to a level of administrative detail that would make a modern-day librarian weep. The very act of managing this collection required a kind of obsessive genius, a theme we'll be exploring in the next section. For now, you simply stand and stare at the quiet evidence of this grand, slightly ridiculous, and utterly fascinating project. The air around you, once again, feels still and heavy, a profound silence in a space that once buzzed with the intellectual chatter of 1,000 stolen books. The door with the ship carving feels less like an entrance and more like a trophy room. You step through another large doorway, leaving the main hall of the library behind. The air here is different, less quiet and dusty, more alive with the low murmur of conversation and the soft scratching of styluses on wax tablets. You've just entered the Mausion, the intellectual engine room of the whole operation. The name itself, Shrine of the Muses, gives you a sense of the reverence with which these people approached knowledge. It wasn't just a building, it was a sacred space for thinking, learning, and creating. This wasn't a public library in the modern sense. It was more like a highly exclusive, live-in university, a think tank for the brightest minds in the Hellenistic world. You see scholars huddled in small groups, arguing passionately about astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy. Some are meticulously drawing diagrams on a smooth stone floor with charcoal, while others are dictating new works to scribes. It was here, within these very walls, that the foundation for many of our modern scientific disciplines was laid. It was here that scholars like Euclid wrote Elements, a work that basically defined geometry for the next 2 millennia. You see a man hunched over a tablet, sketching intricate geometric shapes, and you have to wonder if it's the great Euclid himself, lost in a world of angles and circles. You also catch sight of a few older gentlemen staring intently at the night sky from an open-air courtyard. This is where the astronomer Aristarchus of Samos proposed a heliocentric model of the universe, the idea that the Earth revolves around the Sun, a concept so far ahead of its time that it was largely ignored. It's a surreal moment. Standing in a place where such groundbreaking, almost heretical ideas were first conceived, it makes you realize just how far back the roots of modern science really go. The Mausion was a bit like a modern-day academic campus, but with way fewer student loans and a lot more free food. The scholars, poets, and doctors who worked here were all on the king's payroll. They were provided with lodging, a communal dining hall, and a salary, all to ensure they could dedicate their lives entirely to their work. Think of it, no need for a side hustle, no worrying about rent. Your only job was to be smart and to contribute to the collective knowledge. You can imagine the atmosphere, a bit competitive, probably, with everyone wanting to be the next big name, but also a true melting pot of ideas from across the known world. It was a true brain trust, a collection of geniuses all living and working in close proximity. As you wander, you come across a small, almost hidden room. It's filled with what look like ancient medical instruments, and the smell is an odd combination of herbs and something vaguely metallic. This was the anatomy wing. Here, Herophilus and Erasistratus, two of the most famous physicians of their time, conducted groundbreaking work on human anatomy. You cringe a little as you remember the more gruesome details you've read about their work. They were the first to dissect human bodies to study the organs. This was highly controversial even then. A quirky little tidbit of history is that some accounts, likely exaggerated, claimed that Ptolemy Philadelphus even allowed them to perform vivisections, dissections of living criminals. Historians still argue whether this truly happened or if it was just a sensational rumor spread by their rivals. But even without that particular horror, their work was revolutionary. They identified the difference between arteries and veins, and they figured out that the brain was the center of the nervous system, not the heart as was commonly believed. The whole place hums with a focused, almost feverish energy. This wasn't a quiet library for casual readers, it was a laboratory of the mind. It was where the world's knowledge was not just stored, but actively questioned, expanded, and debated. You hear a burst of laughter from a nearby room and a raised voice exclaiming, "A whole world within a drop of water, the scientific inquiry, the peer review, the relentless pursuit of truth." You can see the faint echoes of the Mausion in every modern university and research lab. They started something that, for better or worse, is still going on today. Your quiet tour of the Mausion continues, but your guide now beckons you to follow them through a different exit, leading you back out into the bustling, sun-drenched streets of ancient Alexandria. The air is thick with the smells of the marketplace, spices, roasted meat, and the ever-present scent of the sea. It's a jarring shift from the hushed intellectualism you just left behind. You trudge past vendors hawking their wares, their voices a cacophony of commerce, and you wonder what sort of boring historical detail could possibly be found out here. But you soon turn a corner and are greeted by a new sight, a massive temple complex dedicated to the Egyptian god Serapis. You can tell this place is important from the sheer scale of the columns and the intricate carvings on the facade. This, you are informed, is the Serapeum, and it was much more than just a temple. The Serapeum was a secondary library, a sort of satellite campus for the main Great Library. While the main library was the hub of cutting-edge research and original scholarship, the Serapeum was more of a public-facing institution. It was built, in part, to hold the overflow of scrolls from the main library, but it also served a different, more social function. It was a place where ordinary citizens of Alexandria, well, the literate ones, anyway, could come to read and learn. It had its own collection, and while it wasn't as comprehensive as the main libraries, it was still a vast and impressive repository of knowledge. It was a place where people who weren't on the royal payroll could still engage with the intellectual life of the city. You can imagine a young Alexandrian, eager to learn, spending their afternoons here, away from the heat and noise of the city, lost in a scroll about Greek drama or Egyptian history. The very existence of this daughter library is a fascinating and often overlooked detail. It shows that the Ptolemies didn't just want to hoard knowledge for an elite few, they also wanted to project an image of a city that was a beacon of learning for everyone. This mainstream historical fact, the two-part library system, reveals a lot about the city's intellectual culture. The main library was the research and development arm, and the Serapeum was the public relations and outreach department. It's a very modern concept, a kind of scholarly dual-track system, but it existed thousands of years ago. You peer into the open doorways, imagining the hushed sounds of people reading, the quiet turn of papyrus as one finished a scroll and moved on to the next. There is a very quirky tidbit about the Serapeum. Legend has it that the library's main cataloguing system, which we'll get into a bit more later, was so complex and detailed that a simplified, more user-friendly version had to be created for the Serapeum. The librarians here, in a moment of ancient genius, created a system based on colours. Scrolls on philosophy were marked with a red tag, poetry with a blue tag, and so on. It was a simple, elegant solution to the problem of a growing collection and a less academically trained user base. You picture a slightly befuddled scholar from the main library coming over to help and being completely lost without his complicated numerical system, and the Serapeum librarian just shaking their head and saying, "Oh, just look for the red ones." This delightful detail highlights a fundamental difference between the two libraries' functions. This focus on accessibility, even in a society with low literacy rates, speaks volumes. Yet, there's an ongoing scholarly debate about the Serapeum. Historians still argue whether the Serapeum was genuinely meant to be a public library, or if it was simply a holding pen for duplicates that the main library didn't have space for. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. But its public function is what has been most remembered. It gave the city an air of intellectual vitality, and it cemented Alexandria's reputation as a centre of learning. As you turn to leave the temple ground, you can't help but feel that you've seen a true piece of cultural history, a building that was, in its own way, a bridge between the high scholarship of the Mauseion and the curiosity of the common person. The sun shines down on the great temple, and its stone seems to radiate not just heat, but the warm glow of human curiosity. You're now back inside what feels like a secondary storeroom of the great library. And the scent here is different. Less papyrus and more beeswax and leather. The lighting is dim, and the shelves are a bit more haphazardly arranged. This is where you see the library's physical collection in a new light. Literally, instead of the tight rolls of papyrus, you're looking at something different, stacks of what look like modern books. These, your guide explains, are codices. The shift from scroll to codex is one of the most boring, yet profoundly important, technological changes in the history of information. It's the difference between a long, unwieldy scroll you have to unroll and re-roll every time you read it, and a simple, bound book you can flip through with one hand for centuries. The scroll was the gold standard for writing. It was made of long sheets of papyrus or parchment, glued together, and rolled onto a wooden rod. To read it, you had to unroll it with one hand while rolling it up with the other. It was clumsy, fragile, and a little ridiculous. Want to find a specific passage? Too bad. You'd have to unroll the entire thing to get there. It was a linear, one-way street of information. But then, in the Roman world and later in the Christian era, the codex started to gain popularity. It was essentially a stack of pages bound together on one side. Just like the books you have on your shelf today, the codex was a game changer. It was compact, durable, and most importantly, it allowed for random access to information. You could flip to any page instantly. You could write on both sides of the page, saving a ton of material. And you could easily carry a whole collection of texts in one small, neat volume. You can just picture a scholar in Alexandria, tired of unrolling and re-rolling a 20-foot scroll, seeing a codex for the first time and having a profound moment of enlightenment. Wait, you can just turn the page? It's brilliant. This mainstream historical fact, the transition from scroll to codex, is a perfect example of how a seemingly minor technological innovation can completely revolutionize an entire industry. It made the preservation and dissemination of knowledge so much more efficient. It's a testament to the fact that sometimes the most important changes are not grand political movements or great battles, but small, incremental improvements to daily life. You can just see a librarian struggling with a massive roll of papyrus, sighing with relief at the sight of a sturdy leather-bound codex. Now, for a slightly quirky tidbit, even after the codex became popular, the Great Library and its scholars were slow to adopt it. They were staunch traditionalists. The scroll was the proper way to write and read. They saw the codex as a newfangled, flimsy fad. They considered it more for personal notes or cheap popular fiction than for serious scholarly work. This resistance to change, this intellectual snobbery, is a common theme throughout history. It's the equivalent of a modern-day academic insisting on writing everything on a manual typewriter because that's how real scholars do it. The librarians and scholars of Alexandria were the proud, stubborn purists of their day. Historians still argue whether the slow adoption of the codex contributed to the library's eventual decline. Maybe if they had embraced this new technology, they would have been able to make more copies of their texts, saving more of them from destruction. The codex was just better for mass production, and the library's clinging to scrolls was a missed opportunity. This is all speculation, of course, but it's a fascinating what-if. You look at the stacks of these bound volumes and think about how they represent the future, a future the librarians of Alexandria could only dimly perceive. The air here, in this room of codices, feels less like a dusty past and more like a quiet prologue to the next 2,000 years of human knowledge. You walk out of the codex room and find yourself in a large, bright hall with a dozen long tables. The sound here is a methodical, almost rhythmic rustling, and it's coming from the dozens of scholars working diligently at each table. They are not just reading, they are cataloguing. Piles of new scrolls are stacked on one side, and on the other, meticulously labelled rolls are being sorted into shelves. This is the office of the chief librarian, and a man sits at a central desk, a look of profound concentration on his face. This is the kind of boring history that truly makes you want to lie down and take a nap. But here, in this very room, the system for organizing the world's knowledge was essentially invented. The man you're looking at is likely Callimachus of Cyrene. He was a poet, scholar, and, most importantly for our purposes, the chief cataloguer of the Library of Alexandria. He was tasked with the absolutely monumental job of creating a comprehensive index of the entire collection. This task was so mind-numbingly huge that it would be the ancient equivalent of trying to manually create a searchable database of the entire internet, by hand, on papyrus. And he did it. The result of his work was a 120-book-long catalogue called the Pinnaces. The name literally means tablets, and it was a masterpiece of organizational genius. It was the first systematic attempt to categorize an entire library's collection. The Pinnaces organized the scrolls by subject matter, poetry, history, medicine, and so on, and then alphabetized the authors within each subject. It even included short biographies of the authors and the first line of their works. This wasn't just a list, it was a reference tool, a bibliographic marvel, and the direct ancestor of the Dewey Decimal System and the Library of Congress classification. The fact that a single person, with no computers, no copy machines, and no little rolling library ladders, could do this is a testament to the sheer force of human will and a healthy dose of obsessive compulsiveness. This mainstream historical fact, the creation of the Pinnaces, is an intellectual landmark. It fundamentally changed how we interact with information. Before this, libraries were just piles of scrolls. If you wanted to find something, you just had to ask a librarian, who would hopefully remember where it was. The Pinnaces made the knowledge contained within the library accessible and searchable. It was the birth of the modern library catalogue, a tool so boringly indispensable that we barely even think about it today. You can just imagine an impatient scholar walking in, and instead of having to rummage through 1,000 scrolls, they could just look up the author in the Pinnaces and be told exactly where to find the text. It must have felt like a kind of ancient magic. And a quirky tidbit about Callimachus and the Pinnaces. The process was so slow and meticulous that Callimachus was famously impatient with the pace of new acquisitions. He would often complain that the librarians were bringing in new scrolls faster than he could catalogue them. He even wrote a short, sarcastic poem about it, a kind of ancient version of a frustrated IT guy complaining about users. He also had a very specific rule for how the scrolls were to be labelled. Each one had a small tag, or syllabus, and he insisted that the name of the author be written in a specific style of neat, small script so as not to take up too much space. He was a stickler for the details, a kind of ancient font nerd, if you will. Historians still argue whether the Pinakes was ever truly completed. The library's collection was constantly growing, and the sheer volume of new scrolls would have made it nearly impossible to keep up. Some scholars believe that the Pinakes was more of an ongoing project than a finished work, a beautiful, never-ending list that was always in a state of flux. You look at the scribes, diligently copying Callimachus's work, and you can feel the quiet, endless work of history being written. One entry at a time, the air feels heavy, not with the weight of dusty knowledge, but with the quiet, endless labor of organization. You're now standing outside, on a slightly raised dais, looking out over the imagined ruins of the great library. The sun is setting, casting long shadows, and you can almost feel a cool, empty wind where the great halls once stood. The question on everyone's mind, the one that lingers over every discussion of this place, is what happened to it? How could such a monumental repository of knowledge simply disappear? The popular narrative, the one you probably learned in a movie or a book, is that it burned down in a single, catastrophic blaze. This dramatic story, a kind of scholarly bonfire, makes for great cinema. But it is, like so many simple explanations for complex events, mostly a myth. The mainstream historical fact about the library's demise is that it didn't happen all at once. There was no single, unifying event that destroyed it forever. Instead, it was a long, drawn-out process of decline, a slow death by 1,000 cuts. The library and the Mousillon were a part of a dynamic, often violent, city. As the political power shifted, so did the funding and focus. The first blow came when Ptolemy VIII Physcon expelled many of the scholars in 145 BC, scattering their knowledge and their work across the Hellenistic world. It was less of a fire and more of an intellectual diaspora. Subsequent rulers were less interested in funding a giant think tank and more interested in political games and military campaigns. Then came the accidental damage. As you look out over the ruins, you can almost hear the distant clang of swords and the shouts of soldiers. The Roman conquest of Egypt was a messy affair, and the city of Alexandria, with its famous port, was right in the middle of it. This leads us to the most famous, if still debated, event in the library's decline, an event we will explore in a bit more detail in the next section. The library was not a single, unassailable building, but a series of structures, and its collections were often moved and stored in various places. The decay was a process, not a singular moment of fiery drama, a quirky, almost sad tidbit is the story of the bookworms, not the humankind, but the actual insects. As the funding for the library dwindled, so did the staff. The scrolls, made of organic papyrus, were a favorite food for various insects and molds, without a dedicated team of librarians to carefully unroll, clean, and re-oil them. The scrolls simply started to rot away. You can just picture a librarian sighing as he finds a particularly valuable text with half a dozen tiny, chewed-up holes running down its length. So, while we talk about grand fires and ancient conflicts, a huge portion of the library's collection may have been lost to the slow, silent munching of termites. It's a very undramatic end for such a dramatic institution, and it's a testament to the fact that preservation is a constant, boring battle against the forces of decay. Historians still argue whether the library's true destruction was an act of deliberate malice. The late Roman and Christian writers often blamed the Muslims, who conquered Alexandria in the 7th century AD, for burning the library on the orders of the Caliph Omar. The story goes that he said, "If these writings of the Greeks agree with the Book of God, they are useless and need not be preserved. If they disagree, they are pernicious and must be destroyed." But most modern historians dismiss this as a myth, a piece of propaganda written centuries later. The library, in any meaningful sense, was likely long gone by then. Its decline was a slow, agonizing process, a kind of intellectual entropy. You stand in the quiet dusk and realize that the most powerful thing about the story of the library is not how it ended, but what it was in the first place, a glorious, if ultimately fragile, monument to human curiosity. The stillness of the evening air feels less like a quiet aftermath and more like the end of a very long, very slow exhale. You are now standing in the same imagined space, but the air feels charged and smells faintly of smoke, not from a campfire but from something more sinister. We're looking at the single, most cited event for the library's destruction, a story that, while incomplete, is a mainstream historical fact that points to a real moment of crisis. The year is 48 BC, and the most famous Roman in the world, Julius Caesar, is in Alexandria. He is not there on a vacation, but rather as part of a civil war, a conflict with Pompey, and he finds himself besieged in the royal quarter of the city by the forces of Cleopatra's rival, her brother, Ptolemy XIII. To protect his fleet in the harbour, he makes a tactical decision that would have devastating, though likely unintended, consequences for the world of knowledge. Caesar orders his men to set fire to the Egyptian ships in the harbour. The flames spread. Now, this is where the details get a bit fuzzy, and historians still argue about the exact path of the fire. The fire was meant to be contained to the naval arsenal, but in the chaos of battle, it jumped the harbour and spread to the wharves and warehouses. One of those warehouses was a building that housed a significant number of scrolls, either a portion of the Great Library's collection, or perhaps a different, smaller library, or even just scrolls that were being stored for export. The fire, in all likelihood, was a case of tragic collateral damage, not a deliberate act of cultural vandalism. This is a powerful and very boring historical fact because it perfectly illustrates how much of history is just a series of unfortunate accidents. The Library of Alexandria, this symbol of global knowledge, may have been brought to its knees not by a conquering hero or a religious fanatic, but by a simple, ill-judged tactical decision during a war. You can picture Caesar, a man who saw himself as a patron of arts and letters, looking at the smoke and perhaps not even realizing the scale of his mistake until it was too late. The loss of scrolls was likely a tragic footnote in his much bigger story of conquest. Now for a quirky tidbit. There's a persistent legend that Caesar's fire didn't just burn scrolls, it also destroyed an entire shipment of crocodile dung. You probably remember that weird detail from the intro. I told you we'd come back to it. While a little gross, this isn't as random as it sounds. Crocodile dung was a known ingredient in ancient Egyptian medicine and was used as a kind of ancient sunscreen and insect repellent. It was a trade commodity. So, it's not completely unbelievable that a warehouse filled with goods for export might have contained this particular, rather strange item. This detail, though not a verifiable fact, adds a kind of bizarre, visceral reality to the event. The smoke wasn't just of burning papyrus, but of 1,000 other things, including a particularly nasty-smelling component of ancient Egyptian health and beauty. It brings a smile to your face to imagine the chaos, the screams of soldiers, and the smell of burning poo mingling with the scent of smouldering papyrus. It makes the grand, historical moment feel a bit more real and a lot more ridiculous. Historians still argue whether the fire had a lasting impact on the library. Some believe that the loss was minimal, confined to a small, isolated storehouse. Others argue that it was a crippling blow from which the library never fully recovered. The truth, as is often the case, is probably in the middle. The fire was not the sole cause of the library's demise, but it was certainly a significant event in its long, slow decline. It was an example of how a singular, catastrophic event could accelerate a long process of neglect. The air around you feels less tense, more like the lingering stillness after a passing storm. The great library's death wasn't a fiery climax, but a long, slow decay. The imagined scent of smoke and crocodile dung fades, replaced by the cool, scholarly air of a later era. The long, slow decline of the library continued for centuries after Caesar's fire. The Roman Empire had a different kind of interest in Alexandria, a more administrative one. The city was a crucial grain supplier, the breadbasket of Rome, but its intellectual prestige had waned. The Mouseion was still there, but it was a ghost of its former self. Its scholars no longer at the vanguard of new discovery. You walk through what was once a bustling intellectual hub, now a quiet, almost forgotten corner of a city focused more on trade and politics. The library's collection, diminished and scattered, was no longer a major point of pride for the city's rulers. This is the period of the final, agonizing breaths of Alexandria's great intellectual institution, and the story of its end is best told through the fate of a singular figure, a woman named Hypatia. Hypatia was a mathematician, an astronomer, and a philosopher. a brilliant and respected teacher in a male-dominated world. She was the head of the Platonist school in Alexandria and was known for her lectures on geometry and philosophy. She was a celebrity in her time, and students would come from all over the Roman world to hear her speak. She was a living, breathing testament to the lingering intellectual vitality of Alexandria. However, her life and her death perfectly illustrate the city's shift from a tolerant, multicultural hub of knowledge to a place of dangerous, religious and political fanaticism. The mainstream historical fact here is that Hypatia was brutally murdered by a mob of Christians in 415 AD. The story of her death is a somber and frankly horrifying one. She was caught in the middle of a vicious power struggle between the city's Roman prefect, Orestes, and the Christian bishop, Cyril. Orestes was a friend and admirer of Hypatia, and her association with him, combined with her status as a pagan and a prominent intellectual, made her a convenient target. The mob, incited by a paranoid and zealous Christian preacher, dragged her from her carriage, stripped her, and flayed her alive with oyster shells. It's a gruesome and profoundly sad end for a woman of such grace and intellect. Now for a quirky tidbit, there's a theory, though it's not widely accepted, that the mob that killed Hypatia believed they were not just killing a pagan, but also silencing a piece of the city's scientific legacy. Some scholars believe that Hypatia was a kind of living library, a repository of knowledge from a dying era. She was one of the last prominent pagan intellectuals in the city, and her death symbolized the end of the long period of open inquiry and tolerance. The mob wasn't just targeting a person, they were targeting a worldview, a tradition of secular thought that they saw as a threat. The fact that the story of her death, a story of pure, senseless violence, has been so vividly remembered speaks to its symbolic power. It's the kind of story that feels more like an old myth than a historical fact, a warning about what happens when blind faith overtakes rational thought. Historians still argue whether the mob that killed Hypatia also destroyed what was left of the Library of Alexandria's physical collection. The Serapeum, that beautiful daughter library we visited earlier, was famously destroyed by Christians in a similar riot around 391 AD. So it's not out of the realm of possibility. Some scholars believe that the library's last remaining scrolls were housed in a small annex near her school and were destroyed during the rioting that led to her death. Others argue that by 415 AD, there was nothing left to destroy. The library's physical presence had long since decayed, and its final end was a quiet, sad fizzle. Regardless of the truth, the story of Hypatia's death marks the spiritual end of the great library. The very climate that allowed it to flourish, one of open, often chaotic, intellectual debate, was gone forever. You stand in the silence and you can feel the heavy weight of that final, intellectual night. The silence where the library once stood is now a quiet testament to its influence. The physical building and its hundreds of thousands of scrolls may be gone, lost to fire, neglect, and time. But the idea of the Great Library of Alexandria is not. Its legacy is more than just a cautionary tale about the fragility of knowledge. It is a story about the enduring power of ideas. You're no longer walking in the past, but standing in the present, looking back at a long, almost forgotten intellectual trail that leads directly to us. The influence of the library and the scholars who worked there is everywhere. It's in our scientific method, our medical knowledge, and even the way we organize our own libraries and databases. The mainstream historical fact here is that while the library's physical collection was destroyed, its intellectual lineage was not. Many of the scholars, after being expelled by Ptolemy VIII or fleeing later conflicts, spread out across the Roman and Islamic worlds, taking their knowledge with them. They became teachers and researchers in other cities, and they brought with them the texts they had copied from the Pinax and the ideas they had developed in the Mausion. So, a lot of the knowledge from the library didn't just vanish, it was transferred, albeit in a disorganized and piecemeal way. It's a bit like a computer hard drive that crashes, but you still have a bunch of the files saved on a series of ancient, disorganized floppy disks. It's a messy process, but the information isn't completely lost. A quirky, almost sad, tidbit is that the most famous example of this intellectual transfer is probably the translation movement in the Islamic world a few centuries later. Scholars in Baghdad, under the Abbasid caliphs, went on a massive quest to find and translate ancient Greek works into Arabic. They scoured the Byzantine and Persian empires, looking for old manuscripts that were often the copies of the originals from Alexandria. The very fact that they knew what to look for, the works of Euclid, Archimedes, Galen, and Ptolemy, is a testament to the enduring influence of the library's cataloguing efforts. In a way, the Pinakes was the ghost in the machine, guiding future scholars to lost works. The Islamic scholars then built on this knowledge, preserving it and adding to it, a tradition that would eventually find its way back to Europe and spark the Renaissance. Historians still argue whether we can truly trace a direct, unbroken line from the Library of Alexandria to the modern world. It's a little more complicated than that, but what is undeniable is that the mindset, the very ethos of the library, a commitment to systematic research, to the collection and organization of all available knowledge, and to open scholarly debate, has survived. The physical library may be gone, but the idea of it lives on in every research university, every national library, and every online database you've ever used. You can see its spirit in the quiet, obsessive work of modern historians and scientists, in the slow, meticulous process of sifting through old documents to uncover a new fact. The journey we've just taken, through its founding, its glory, and its slow, sad end, is not just a look back at a dusty ruin, but a contemplation of the very foundations of human knowledge. The air feels clear and still now, a fitting end to this particular chapter of our journey. Now, we leave the quiet halls of Alexandria and prepare to enter a new, far more mysterious world. The quiet echo of Alexandria's library is fading behind you now. The air, once thick with the scent of papyrus and the hum of intellectual life, is now growing thin and cool as you begin a long, slow ascent. You trudge upward, your feet finding purchase on a narrow, winding path. The landscape is changing from the flat, coastal plains of Egypt to the rugged, stone-strewn hills of central Greece. The sun beats down on your back, but the breeze carries a sense of anticipation. You are on your way to the most famous spiritual hotspot in the ancient world, a place of prophecy and myth, the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi. The journey itself is a bit of a slog, a great, boring hike, but as you get closer, you see why it was worth the climb. The setting is breathtakingly dramatic. The sanctuary is nestled into the side of Mount Parnassus, a natural amphitheatre of steep rock faces and jagged peaks. The silence here is profound, broken only by the wind whistling through the crags and the distant bleating of sheep. You can see why the Greeks believed this place was sacred. It feels like a portal, a place where the earthly and the divine could meet. This is the home of the oracle at Delphi, a title held by the high priestess of Apollo, known as the Pythia. She was the most sought-after prophet in the ancient world, and her pronouncements could change the course of empires. Kings, generals, and commoners all made the pilgrimage here, their journeys fueled by anxiety and hope. The mainstream historical fact about the oracle at Delphi is that it was not just a fortune-teller's tent, it was a powerful, political institution. States would send official envoys to consult the oracle before making major decisions, like going to war, founding a new colony, or changing their laws. The Pythia's word was considered the word of Apollo himself, and it carried immense weight. The Delphic sanctuary was a kind of United Nations of the ancient Greek world, a neutral ground where city-states could consult a higher authority. It gave Delphi, a tiny, remote town, an outsized influence on world events. You can imagine a nervous general waiting for his turn, wondering if the fate of his entire army rests on a few cryptic sentences. Now for a quirky little tidbit that shows how weird and human these places were. The Pythia was always an older, local woman from the village of Delphi. She had to be a virgin, or at least have lived a chaste life for a long time. But she didn't have to be of any particular intellectual or noble standing. In fact, she was often illiterate. This was a deliberate choice. The Greeks wanted to make sure that the prophecy was coming from Apollo, not from the priestess's own thoughts or political leanings. It was believed that a simple mind was a more open vessel for divine communication. So, the most powerful woman in the Greek world was often a humble peasant who couldn't read or write. It's a beautifully ironic detail. Historians still argue whether the Pythia's prophetic trance was real or just a show. The ancient accounts describe her as falling into a kind of ecstatic fit, speaking in a strange voice, and sometimes even foaming at the mouth. Some scholars believe she was simply an actress, cleverly manipulating her audience with a little help from the priests who would interpret her vague pronouncements. Others believe that she might have been under the influence of something, perhaps a natural gas seeping from the ground. As you look at the rocky landscape around you, you can almost imagine a fissure in the earth, releasing a dizzying, intoxicating vapor. The answer, like so many ancient mysteries, is lost to time. But for now, you simply stand at the mouth of the sanctuary, ready to enter a place where logic gives way to faith, and the future is held in a single, whispered phrase. The air feels cool and expectant. The air now feels thick and heavy, not with dust, but with something more ancient, something that hums with a faint, psychic energy. You stand at the entrance of the Temple of Apollo, a truly impressive stone structure. You make your way inside, your steps echoing on the cold marble floor. There's a central chasm in the floor, and a faint, sweet smell hangs in the air, like a mix of rotting leaves and a forgotten perfume. This is the Aditon, the most sacred part of the temple, and it's where the magic, or the boredom, really happens. In the center, sitting on a three-legged stool called a tripos, is the Pythia. She is an older woman, dressed in a simple white robe, her face serene. But you can feel the tension in the room. This is it. This is the moment a king or general has been waiting for, a moment that could change the course of a battle or a dynasty. The mainstream historical fact here is the method of the prophecy itself. The Pythia would drink from the sacred spring of Chrysotis, chew on laurel leaves, and then sit on the tripos over a fissure in the rock. The Greeks believed that the sacred spring and the vapors from the ground were what allowed Apollo to possess the Pythia and speak through her. As the vapors rose, she would fall into a trance. The ancient accounts describe her as convulsing, moaning, and speaking in a garbled, nonsensical way. The priests of the temple, known as the prophetai, the word from which we get prophet, would then interpret her frenzied utterances and translate them into a clear, often cryptic, poetic verse for the petitioner. It was a bizarre, two-step process, a kind of divine game of telephone. The Pythia was the raw, untamed channel, and the priests were the filters, the PR department for the gods. The whole thing was probably very undramatic to watch in person. You can almost hear the soft, bored whispers of a priest. "Oh, here she goes again," as the Pythia starts her performance. But the end result, the cryptic couplet that could dictate the fate of a city, was what mattered. For instance, a city might ask, "Should we go to war with our neighbor?" And the priest would come back with something like, "When the eagle is near, the dove must hide its feathers in the night." It's so vague that you could interpret it to mean almost anything, which, of course, was the point. The ambiguity gave the priests and the oracles a kind of plausible deniability. If a prophecy went wrong, it was the fault of the petitioner for misinterpreting it, not the fault of the oracle for being wrong, a quirky, and very boring. Tidbit is about those laurel leaves she chewed. The laurel was a plant sacred to Apollo, but modern science has suggested that some species of laurel contain a hallucinogenic compound. So, it's possible that the Pythia's trance was not entirely divine but at least partly chemical. She might have just been tripping out on a powerful plant. This doesn't make it any less fascinating, of course. It just shifts the mystery from a supernatural one to a pharmacological one. It's also possible she was just an exceptionally good actress, and the priests were simply scam artists. Historians still argue about the true nature of her trance. Was it natural gas from the ground? A hallucinogenic plant? Was it a complete fraud? We'll likely never know for sure, but the enduring power of the belief in her visions is what truly matters. You stand in the Aditon, surrounded by the quiet hum of 1,000 unspoken questions. The smell in the air is still there, and you feel a strange sense of expectation. The Pythia's prophecies were a foundational part of the ancient Greek worldview. They represented a belief that the cosmos was not random, that there was a hidden pattern that could, for a moment, be glimpsed. It's a comforting thought, isn't it? Even if it was all just a scam with a side of plant-based hallucinogens. You leave the temple, the cold stone giving way to the warm sunlight, and the memory of the oracle's strange, prophetic ritual lingers. The air outside the temple is clean and cool again, and the scent of that strange perfume is gone, replaced by the natural smell of mountain air and pine. As you walk down a narrow, cobbled path, you see a small, cultivated patch of land tucked away in a quiet corner of the sanctuary. It's filled with plants, and at its center, a single, elegant laurel tree stands. Its leaves are deep, glossy green. This plant, as you now know, was a central and very boring part of the Pythia's ritual. The laurel was sacred to Apollo, and it's from this plant that we get the word laureate, a person crowned for their achievement in poetry or the arts. In ancient Greece, the prize for a winner in the Pythian Games was a crown made of laurel leaves, not a golden statue or a big pile of cash. This simple, vegetal prize tells you something about the values of the time. The mainstream historical fact here is that the laurel was a key part of the ritual for a very specific reason. The ancient Greeks believed that the leaves of the laurel tree contained a kind of divine essence. They thought that by chewing on them, the Pythia was literally consuming the spirit of Apollo, preparing her body and mind to be a vessel for his words. It was a physical and symbolic act, a kind of sacramental meal. You can imagine a priest carefully plucking the right leaves, making sure they were from the most sacred tree, and presenting them to the Pythia with a look of intense seriousness. To them, this was not just a plant, it was a conduit to the divine. This is one of those facts that reminds you just how much of ancient life was intertwined with ritual and magic, even in a place as politically powerful as Delphi. Now for a quirky and much more modern tidbit. In the late 20th century, a team of geologists and archaeologists decided to investigate the possibility that the Pythia's trance was caused by natural gas. They found 2 geological faults running under the temple and discovered traces of ethylene gas in the local water and soil. Ethylene is a colorless, sweet-smelling gas that can produce a euphoric, trance-like state. It's the same gas that causes fruits to ripen. So, the theory goes that the gas was seeping up from the ground, and the Pythia, sitting on her tripod directly over the fissure, was inhaling it. It provides a plausible, scientific explanation for her strange behavior. The sweet smell you might have noticed inside the temple could have been the subtle odor of this gas. It's a beautifully simple explanation for a 2,000-year-old mystery, a perfect fusion of science and myth. Historians still argue whether the ethylene theory is the final word. The amount of gas detected wasn't always consistent, and some scholars believe that the evidence is circumstantial. They point out that the Greeks would have likely noticed if the gas was affecting other people who visited the temple, and there are no historical accounts of this. The debate continues. Was it divine inspiration? Was it an ancient form of drug use? Or was it all just a carefully choreographed show, with the priests and priestess in on the act? We'll probably never know for sure. But the very existence of the debate is fascinating. It's a reminder that even the most enduring myths often have a grounding in a very boring, very physical reality. You stand by the laurel tree, its leaves rustling in the breeze, and you feel the full weight of a history that is both profoundly magical and profoundly scientific at the same time. The simplicity of the plant is in stark contrast to the complexity of the mystery. You're no longer in the quiet sanctuary of Delphi, but in a grand, sun-drenched throne room. Thousands of miles away in the city of Sardis, the capital of ancient Lydia, you stand next to a king, a man of immense wealth and power, who is nervously pacing back and forth. This is King Croesus, a name that has become synonymous with immense riches. He is pondering a massive decision. Should he go to war with the mighty Persian Empire? A man like him, with all his money and military might, would never make a move without a little divine guidance. So, of course, he sent an envoy to the most famous oracle in the world. The mainstream historical fact here is the oracle's cryptic and ultimately fatal prophecy to King Croesus. The envoy presented a series of gifts, a golden lion, golden bricks, and other treasures, and asked the oracle, should King Croesus go to war against the Persians? The Pythia, after her usual ritual, delivered a short, poetic line. If Croesus goes to war, he will destroy a great empire. Croesus and his court were delighted. They interpreted this to mean that his army would destroy the Persian Empire. Confident in his divine blessing, Croesus marched to war. The result, as you may have guessed, was a complete and utter disaster. He was utterly defeated by the Persian king Cyrus the Great, and in the process, he destroyed a great empire, his own. The prophecy was, in a boring, infuriating way, completely true. It was a double-edged sword, a perfect example of the oracle's ambiguity. The fact that the prophecy was vague enough to be interpreted in multiple ways was a feature, not a bug. It gave the oracle a kind of built-in fail-safe. If the petitioner won, it was proof of the oracle's wisdom. If they lost, it was their own fault for misinterpreting the prophecy. It was a brilliant system, a kind of ancient hedge against being wrong. You can almost feel Croesus's gut drop as he realizes his fatal mistake. It's a classic example of hubris, of a man so confident in his own power that he only heard what he wanted to hear. A quirky tidbit about this story is that before he sent his envoy, Croesus conducted a kind of ancient science experiment to test the oracle's power. He sent envoys to 7 different oracles across the Greek world and asked them all to describe what he would be doing on the 100th day after their departure. He wanted to see who was telling the truth. On that day, Croesus decided to do something completely bizarre. He boiled a lamb and a tortoise together in a bronze cauldron with a bronze lid. The Pythia at Delphi gave the correct answer, while the others were completely wrong. This detail is oddly specific and completely true. According to the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, it shows that even a king who believed in the gods still wanted to do a little bit of fact-checking before he trusted them with the fate of his kingdom. Historians still argue whether the story of the tortoise and the lamb is true, or if Herodotus, a fan of a good story, made it up to add some flavor. It's the kind of detail that feels a little too perfect to be real, but regardless of its authenticity, the core lesson of the Croesus story is what has made it endure. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of arrogance and the limits of human understanding. The oracle wasn't giving him an easy answer, she was giving him a riddle, and in the end, it was his own hubris, not the oracle's falsehood, that destroyed his empire. The throne room feels empty and hollow now, the scent of expensive perfume and rich textiles replaced by the silent emptiness that comes after a great and foolish mistake. You've now left the political theatre of King Croesus's mistake and returned to the quiet, more contemplative parts of the Delphic sanctuary. You find yourself walking up the gentle slope of the sacred way, the main path leading to the temple, but you're not looking at the grand monuments or the offerings from various city-states. Instead, your eyes are drawn to something much smaller, something far more personal. Inscribed on the walls and columns of the Temple of Apollo and on the surrounding treasuries are short, punchy sayings, a kind of ancient self-help philosophy. These are the Delphic maxims. They are the boring, everyday wisdom of the ancient world, and they have more to say about how a person should live than any of the oracle's grand pronouncements. There were 147 of them in total, though only a handful are truly famous today. You stop to read a few. They're ancient Greek letters, now a little worn with age. They're not the kind of grand philosophy you'd find in Plato. They're more like the ancient equivalent of a motivational poster. The most famous one, inscribed over the temple's entrance, is "Know Thyself." It's so simple and yet so profound, a call to self-awareness that has echoed through the centuries. Another one, "Nothing in excess," is a direct instruction for living a life of moderation and balance. You see others, like "Promise a gift," and "Sorrow is present," or "Praise the gods," or "Govern your anger." They are all very short, very clear, and very direct. They were a kind of moral compass for the ancient Greeks, a set of common-sense rules for a good life. The mainstream historical fact about these maxims is that they were attributed to the 7 sages of Greece, a group of legendary wise men from the 6th century BC. While we don't know for sure who came up with them, their attribution to these foundational figures gave them an immense authority. The maxims were a kind of intellectual framework that complemented the spiritual guidance of the oracle. The oracle would tell you what to do in a grand, world-shaking situation, but the maxims told you how to live your life every single day. The oracle was the special occasion, and the maxims were the quiet, reliable wisdom. You can imagine a young Greek waiting for his audience with the Pythia, looking at these maxims on the wall and having a quiet, personal moment of reflection. The boringness of the maxims is their strength. They are timeless and universally applicable. A quirky tidbit about the maxims is that they were not just a suggestion, they were often used in ancient Greek education. Teachers would make their students memorize them as a way to instill a sense of moral and civic duty. They were the flashcards of ancient ethics. The fact that the most sacred place in the Greek world was also a kind of public bulletin board for basic moral lessons is a really charming detail. It shows that even in a place of great spiritual power, the Greeks still had a firm grounding in the practicalities of everyday life. It's a very Greek thing, really, to blend the divine and the mundane. Historians still argue whether the maxims were an original part of the temple's design or if they were added later as a kind of moral overlay. It's a debate that highlights the fact that even in ancient times, the purpose of a sacred space could evolve over time. Were the maxims a foundational piece of the Delphic belief system, or were they a later addition meant to give the oracle more gravitas? The truth is lost to time, but as you walk past them, their quiet wisdom feels more potent and enduring than any of the oracle's dramatic prophecies. They were the constant, reliable heartbeat of Delphi, a quiet hum of good advice that outlasted all the kings and empires that came to consult it. You leave the sanctuary with a sense of peace, a feeling that sometimes the most important truths are the simplest. The quiet wisdom of the maxims is fading behind you now as you begin a slow, almost melancholic descent from the Delphic sanctuary. The sun is now high, and the air is warm, but there is a sense of finality to the atmosphere. We are witnessing the long, slow, and very boring decline of the oracle at Delphi. It wasn't a sudden, cataclysmic event, but a gradual loss of relevance, a slow leak of authority that took centuries to fully drain. The oracle's power waned as the political landscape of the ancient world shifted from the independent Greek city-states to the massive empires of Rome and Macedon. The mainstream historical fact about the oracle's decline is that it was tied directly to the rise of secular power. The oracle was at its peak during a time of great uncertainty, when city-states were constantly at war and kings needed divine reassurance. But as the Macedonian and then the Roman empires gained dominance, they had less need for a distant, ambiguous spiritual guide. They had armies, laws, and a very practical approach to ruling. When the Roman general Sulla sacked Athens in 86 BC, he also plundered Delphi, taking many of its treasures to fund his war effort. This wasn't a religious act, but a practical, military one. The oracle's power was no match for the might of a Roman legion. Its fate was sealed not by a lack of faith, but by a lack of political utility. The oracle's prophecies became less about grand military campaigns and more about petty, personal matters. A quirky, almost humorous tidbit that marks this decline is the story of the Roman Emperor Nero. In 66 AD, he visited Delphi and was, according to some accounts, so unimpressed with the oracle's prophecy that he had the priests arrested. What was the prophecy? The Pythia allegedly told him, "You will die soon, but you will not have to worry about the future." He, of course, was furious, and he took it to mean she was insulting him. The fact that a powerful emperor could be so openly disdainful of the oracle shows just how far its prestige had fallen. The place that had once been a destination for kings was now little more than a tourist attraction for a bored, paranoid emperor. It was less about seeking spiritual guidance and more about a chance to get a selfie with a celebrity prophet. Historians still argue whether the final destruction of the oracle was a deliberate act of Christian zealotry, or if it was just a final, quiet abandonment. Emperor Theodosius I, in 392 AD, issued a series of decrees that banned pagan worship throughout the Roman Empire. The oracle at Delphi was a prime target. While there's no evidence of a dramatic, fiery destruction like the one imagined for the Library of Alexandria, the temples were certainly closed, their cults suppressed, and the priests and Pythia were forced to stop their work. The end came not with a bang, but with a bureaucratic order. The final words of the oracle, according to a 4th century AD historian, were given to a visitor who asked why the temple was silent. The Pythia said, "Tell the king that the adorned house has fallen to the ground. Phoebus no longer has his hut, nor his prophetic laurel, nor his speaking spring." It was a poetic, sombre end to a very long, very grand story. The sanctuary is now silent and still, a beautiful ruin, its stones whispering of a time when the gods still spoke to mortals. The stillness of Delphi is now a distant memory, replaced by a sense of dread and confinement. The air is warm and heavy, and it smells of sweat and damp stone. You are no longer in a temple or a library, but in a dark, oppressive labyrinth. The path is narrow and twisting, and the walls feel close and suffocating. You can hear a faint, low bellowing in the distance, a sound that is both animal and human, a sound that makes your blood run cold. You have just entered the world of the Minotaur. This is one of the most famous Greek myths, a tale of a terrible beast, an inescapable maze, and a yearly, horrific tribute. The mainstream historical fact here is the tragic origin of the Minotaur. The story begins on the island of Crete with its powerful ruler, King Minos. Minos had a bit of a problem. He needed to prove to his subjects that he was the rightful king, so he prayed to the sea god Poseidon for a sign, and in response, a magnificent white bull rose from the sea. Minos was supposed to sacrifice the bull to Poseidon as a show of gratitude, but he couldn't resist its beauty and kept it for himself, sacrificing a lesser bull instead. This, as you can imagine, infuriated Poseidon, who was not a god to be trifled with. As punishment, Poseidon made Minos' wife, Queen Pasiphae, fall madly in love with the bull. It's a bit of an awkward situation, to say the least. The result of this unholy union was the Minotaur, a creature with the head of a bull and the body of a man. The name itself means Bull of Minos. The beast was a terrifying mix of divine punishment and human transgression, a living, breathing symbol of the king's hubris. Minos was horrified by the monster, but he couldn't bring himself to kill it, as it was a kind of perverse son to his wife. So, he commissioned the greatest inventor of the time, a man named Daedalus, to build an inescapable prison for the creature. This prison, as you're now realizing as you trudge through it, was the labyrinth. Every year, to keep the beast at bay, the city of Athens, which Minos had conquered, was forced to send a tribute of 7 young men and 7 young women. They would be released into the labyrinth, where they would wander until they were found and devoured by the Minotaur. A quirky and very gross tidbit about the Minotaur is that in some versions of the myth, the Minotaur wasn't just a mindless beast, but a very sad and lonely creature that was also a vegetarian. Some accounts claim that because of its human body, it found it hard to stomach meat, and that its victims would just get lost in the labyrinth and die of starvation or thirst. Not a glorious, violent death at the hands of a monster. The Minotaur was just a lonely, misunderstood bullman with a dietary preference, stuck in a confusing maze. This detail makes the myth both more and less terrifying at the same time. The beast's fate was a kind of eternal, profound loneliness. Historians still argue whether the Minotaur myth was just a myth, or if it had a basis in historical reality. Some scholars believe that the story of the yearly tribute to Crete was an elaborate justification for a kind of ancient tax, a way for Athens to explain why they had to send people and goods to their powerful neighbours. Others believe that the myth was an exaggeration of a real, bull-related ritual on the island of Crete. Was the myth a warning about the dangers of hubris and a reflection of a real-world political rivalry? Or was it just a good story? You stand in the silence of the labyrinth, the only sound the slow drip of water from the stone walls, and the answer, like the way out, is lost in the darkness. The dark, twisting corridors of the labyrinth now feel more oppressive than ever. You are not alone. You are with King Minos himself, the ruler of Crete. But you are not seeing him at the height of his power. You are seeing him in a moment of great, boring, logistical frustration. He is standing over a man who is sketching out an impossibly complex design on a wax tablet. This man is Daedalus, the legendary inventor, and he has been given the task of building an inescapable prison for the Minotaur. This isn't the dramatic part of the myth, this is the tedious, almost bureaucratic part. The mainstream historical fact about the labyrinth is that it was a marvel of ancient engineering, designed to confuse and disorient anyone who entered it. The word labyrinth has come to mean any maze, but the original labyrinth was not a series of dead ends and confusing turns, but a single, winding path that always led to the center and then back out again. The design was so cunningly complex that once inside, you would lose all sense of direction. It was a kind of psychological prison, a place where you were trapped not by physical barriers, but by your own confusion. Daedalus was a master craftsman, a kind of ancient tech bro who was commissioned by the king to solve a very peculiar problem. A quirky tidbit that brings a little bit of levity to this dark tale is the story of how Daedalus came up with the idea. Legend has it that he was inspired by the winding dance performed by the Cretan people, a kind of ancient folk dance that mimicked the intricate, spiraling patterns of the labyrinth. So, the great, terrifying maze was a direct inspiration from a light-hearted, communal dance. It's an absurd contrast, a joyful celebration of life being transformed into a place of death and despair. You can almost picture Daedalus watching the dance, a quiet, sinister smile on his face as he realizes the potential for his new, terrible invention. The dance's name, Geranos, crane dance, even mirrored the winding flight of the birds. Historians still argue whether the labyrinth was a real place or just a metaphor for the intricate and confusing palace of Knossos. The palace, which was excavated by Sir Arthur Evans in the early 20th century, is a massive, sprawling complex with hundreds of rooms and a confusing layout. It would have been easy for a foreigner to get lost in it. So, was the myth of the labyrinth a historical memory of a real, confusing building, exaggerated over centuries into a mythical maze with a monster in the middle? Or was it just a story meant to symbolize the power of King Minos and his control over a dangerous world? The answer is probably a bit of both. The labyrinth may have been a real palace, but the Minotaur was a very real symbol of the dangers of a world without heroes. You stand in the silence, the walls of the maze pressing in on you, and you can feel the quiet, chilling ingenuity of Daedalus's design. The labyrinth's walls feel cold and silent, but the story that led to its creation is anything but. We're going back in time to the palace of King Minos, but this time, the focus is not on him, but on his wife, Queen Pasiphae. Her tale is one of divine revenge and a truly bizarre, almost farcical, transgression. You are in the queen's private quarters, and the air smells of exotic perfumes and, strangely, of fresh-cut wood and leather. You see the queen, a woman of great beauty and dignity, whispering to a man who is hunched over a workbench, his hands covered in sawdust. This man is the legendary inventor, Daedalus, and he is a kind of ancient accomplice in a royal scandal. The mainstream historical fact about Pasiphae is that she was cursed by the sea god Poseidon to fall madly in love with the magnificent white bull that had risen from the sea. As we've discussed, her husband, King Minos, had angered Poseidon by refusing to sacrifice the bull. Pasiphae's desire for the animal was a kind of living, breathing, and deeply awkward punishment for her husband's hubris. She was the collateral damage in a divine feud. The curse was so powerful that it drove her to a state of near madness. The queen, in her love-struck state, was desperate to consummate her passion for the bull, and in a moment of utter desperation, she turned to the one man who could solve her problem, the inventor Daedalus. Now for a very quirky, and frankly hilarious, tidbit. Pasiphae, in her madness, had a plan that was so strange it could only have been born from a combination of divine influence and sheer boredom. She asked Daedalus to build her a hollow wooden cow. The cow was so lifelike that it was said to be a work of art, a perfect replica of a real animal, complete with a working hinge in its belly. The plan was for Pasiphae to climb inside the wooden cow, and in this bovine disguise, she could lure the bull and satisfy her bizarre desire. You can just picture the scene, the queen, a figure of ultimate grace and power, having to clamber into a wooden box, her dignity completely obliterated by the absurdity of the situation. It's a moment of profound, and profoundly silly, human weakness. The result of this union was, of course, the Minotaur. Historians still argue whether the story of the wooden cow was meant to be taken literally. Some scholars believe it's a later addition to the myth, a kind of salacious detail meant to make the story more titillating and to add a layer of ridicule to the powerful king and his family. Other scholars believe it's a very ancient part of the myth, a testament to the strange and sometimes comical nature of the Greek gods. The fact that the most famous monster in Greek myth was born from such a profoundly silly, almost cartoonish, act is a testament to the way the Greeks viewed their deities. Their gods were all-powerful. Yes, but they were also petty, vindictive, and prone to a kind of dark humour. You stand in the shadows of Pasiphae's quarters, and you can feel the heavy weight of her humiliation. Her story is a reminder that even the most powerful people are subject to the whims of the gods, and that the path to a great tragedy is often paved with a single, bizarre mistake. The Minotaur was a monster, yes, but its birth was a kind of dark joke, a cosmic prank played on a royal family that had taken its power for granted. The air now feels less oppressive, more like a quiet, uneasy laugh. The horror of the Minotaur is forever tied to the absurdity of its origins. The oppressive air of the labyrinth's dark, twisting corridors has been replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. You are no longer with the royal family of Crete, but with a young man, handsome and brave, who is standing on a beach on the island. He is a hero, or at least he's trying to be. This is Theseus, the Prince of Athens, and he is about to enter the labyrinth. He has volunteered to be one of the 14 young people sent as a tribute to the Minotaur. He is not here to be a victim, however, but to end the long reign of terror. The mainstream historical fact about Theseus's entry into the labyrinth is that he didn't do it alone. He had help, and a very crucial piece of help at that. Before he entered the maze, he met a woman who fell madly in love with him. This woman was Ariadne, the daughter of King Minos and Queen Pasiphae. She was horrified by the yearly tribute and was a crucial, and very boring, part of the story. She was not a warrior or a fighter, but she was clever. She gave Theseus 2 things, a sword and a ball of thread. The sword was a simple but practical gift. He needed a weapon to kill the Minotaur, but the thread was the real secret, the key to his survival. He was to tie one end of the thread to the entrance of the labyrinth and unroll it as he walked. Once he had killed the monster, he could simply follow the thread back to the entrance and escape. It's a beautifully simple solution to an impossible problem, a perfect blend of courage and common sense. The labyrinth wasn't just a maze of confusing physical walls, it was also a psychological trap, a place where a person would lose all hope of finding their way out. The thread was more than just a tool, it was a symbol of hope, a physical link to the outside world. Now for a quirky tidbit. There's a version of the story where Ariadne didn't just give him a ball of thread, she gave him a luminous ball of twine, one that glowed in the dark. This detail is often overlooked, but it makes perfect sense. The labyrinth would have been a dark and confusing place, and a glowing thread would have not only shown him the way out, but also provided a little bit of light as he made his way to the center. It's a bit like a kind of ancient glow-in-the-dark rope. This small, unheroic detail is a reminder that even the greatest feats of courage sometimes require a little bit of practical, and very boring, ingenuity. Historians still argue whether the story of the labyrinth and the Minotaur was a historical memory of a real-world ritual or a metaphorical tale about the dangers of hubris. Some scholars believe that the story of the thread was a metaphor for a kind of spiritual guidance, a hidden path to salvation. Others believe it's a very practical solution to a very practical problem. It's the kind of debate that shows us how difficult it is to separate myth from history. But regardless of its origin, the story of Theseus and the thread has become a powerful symbol of hope and ingenuity. You stand at the entrance of the labyrinth, a single, thin thread now tied to your wrist, and you can feel the heavy weight of a great and boring task ahead of you. The air feels tense and expectant, a prelude to a hero's quiet and methodical journey. The quiet focus of your journey into the labyrinth with Theseus is now replaced by a scene of high drama on the Cretan shore. You've just seen Ariadne give the hero the sword and the magical ball of thread. But her role in this story is far from over. In fact, it's about to get incredibly boring and incredibly sad. You are no longer in the action of the myth, but in the quiet aftermath, where a hero's promise is tested and found wanting. The hero, Theseus, has succeeded. He has killed the Minotaur, and with the help of the thread, he has led the 14 Athenian tributes out of the maze. The celebration is joyous. But Ariadne, the woman who made it all possible, is about to learn a very hard lesson about love and heroes. The mainstream historical fact about Ariadne is her abandonment by Theseus. She fled Crete with him, defying her father and her kingdom for a hero she had only just met. Her love for him was so complete that she willingly gave up everything she knew. They sailed away, presumably headed for Athens, where she would be a princess, a queen, or at least a celebrated hero's wife. But a stop was made on the small, desolate island of Naxos. While Ariadne was asleep, Theseus and the rest of the Athenians, for reasons that are still a matter of scholarly debate, sailed away without her. He just left her there, sleeping, on an empty island. It's a moment of profound, anti-heroic betrayal. The man who had saved the Athenians from a monster was, in his own way, a monster himself, a quirky and much more optimistic tidbit is what happened next. The abandonment of Ariadne is not the end of her story. She was found on the island by the god of wine and revelry, Dionysus. Dionysus was so captivated by her beauty and her story of betrayal that he fell in love with her. He made her his wife, and in a grand gesture of love, he took the wedding crown he had given her and threw it into the heavens, where it became the constellation Corona Borealis, the northern crown. So, Ariadne, a human princess who had been betrayed by a mortal hero, was ultimately saved and deified by a god. Her story is a kind of ancient fairy tale, a narrative of a princess who gets a far better deal after she is abandoned. It's a very unboring ending to a very boring act of abandonment. Historians still argue whether the story of Theseus abandoning Ariadne was an original part of the myth or a later addition. Some scholars believe that the story was a kind of political allegory, a way for Athens to distance itself from the Cretan royal family. Others believe that the story of her abandonment was simply a way to explain the religious cults of Ariadne that existed in places like Naxos, which would have been impossible if she had simply sailed off to Athens. The fact that the story has two very different endings, one where she is abandoned and one where she is saved by a god, highlights the way myths could evolve over time to suit different purposes. Was Theseus a hero or a jerk? The Greeks couldn't quite decide. You stand on the empty beach of Naxos. The sound of the waves a soft, rhythmic whisper, and you can almost feel the weight of her quiet, heartbroken solitude. The hero is long gone, and the hero's task is over. But the myth of his betrayal is just beginning. The myth of Theseus and the Minotaur is fading now, and you're leaving the world of gods and heroes behind for something far more grounded and, in its own way, magical archaeology. The air is warm and dusty, and you're no longer on a pristine Greek island, but in a modern excavation site. You stand in front of a sprawling complex of red, yellow, and black stone, a place that looks less like a myth and more like a very real, very confusing ancient palace. This is Knossos, the forgotten capital of ancient Crete and the historical site that gives us the most compelling evidence that the myth of the Minotaur had a basis in reality. The mainstream historical fact here is the work of Sir Arthur Evans, a British archaeologist who, in the early 20th century, excavated the site and claimed to have found the legendary labyrinth. What he found was a vast, multi-storied palace complex with hundreds of interconnected rooms, halls, and courtyards. The building was so large and its layout so intricate that it would have been easy for a first-time visitor to get lost. It was a kind of real-world maze, a sprawling, confusing structure that would have seemed absolutely impossible to someone from the outside. The palace, with its dozens of rooms, was a fitting inspiration for the mythical labyrinth. Evans's work, while controversial, brought a piece of a legendary kingdom to life. You can walk through the corridors and feel the weight of history, a kind of ancient echo of a forgotten civilization, a quirky and very unboring tidbit about the Palace of Knossos is the lack of fortifications. The palace, for all its size and power, was completely unfortified. There were no walls, no towers, no defensive structures to speak of. This suggests that the Minoans, the civilization that built the palace, were so confident in their naval dominance and so secure in their isolation on the island of Crete that they didn't feel the need to build any defenses. Their wall was the sea itself, and their navy was the most powerful in the Aegean. This detail is a fascinating glimpse into a culture that was so confident and so in control of its environment that it had no need for the traditional trappings of a military power. It's a very unheroic and very practical kind of power. Historians still argue whether the Minoan civilization was a peaceful, matriarchal society, as Evans believed, or if it was just as warlike and patriarchal as its Greek neighbours. The lack of fortifications and the emphasis on art and peaceful scenes in their frescoes would suggest a peaceful society. But a small, curious detail has led some historians to believe otherwise. At the Palace of Knossos, they found what are now called horns of consecration, a symbol of a bull's horns. These horns, which were a very common motif in Minoan art, could have been a symbol of religious veneration, or they could have been a symbol of something darker, a kind of religious ritual involving the sacrifice of bulls. This is a scholarly debate that highlights the difficulty of interpreting a culture with no written language. Was the bull a peaceful symbol, or a symbol of sacrifice? Was the palace a peaceful retreat, or a site of dark rituals? The air around you feels thick with unanswered questions, a quiet hum of 1,000 different theories and possibilities. The dusty air of Knossos, so full of history and unanswered questions, now feels a bit darker and more sombre. We're still at the archaeological site, but we are looking at something far more chilling than a confusing palace layout. We are looking at a small, curious detail that has haunted historians for decades, the possibility of human sacrifice in ancient Crete. This is one of those boring historical debates that, when you get to the core of it, is anything but boring. It's about life and death, and it's a quiet whisper of a terrible truth that may be hiding in the details of the Minotaur myth. The mainstream historical fact here is the discovery of what is called the House of the Sacrificed Oxen at Knossos. In a room in this building, archaeologists found the remains of a bull that had been ritually slaughtered. The bull's bones showed that it had been killed in a very specific, ritualistic way, and a small ceremonial knife was found next to it. This discovery, while not a surprise, we know that bull sacrifice was a common part of Minoan religion, was a precursor to a much more grisly discovery at a different site. A quirky, and very disturbing, tidbit is the discovery at the site of Animaspilia in Crete. In 1979, archaeologists unearthed a small temple that had been destroyed by an earthquake. Inside, they found the remains of 4 people. One of them, a young man, was found on a ritual altar, his legs tied down, and a small, ceremonial knife still next to his body. The knife had been used to cut his throat. The bones showed no sign of disease or injury, so it was clear he hadn't died of natural causes. The entire scene was frozen in time by the earthquake, which happened just as the sacrifice was being performed. This discovery, while not at Knossos, lends a terrifying credence to the idea that the Minoans practiced human sacrifice, a tradition that might have inspired the myth of the Minotaur. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or an isolated, desperate act. Some scholars believe that the sacrifice at Animaspilia was a desperate attempt to appease the gods and stop the impending earthquake. It was a kind of last-ditch effort, a terrible choice made in a moment of panic. Other scholars argue that this was part of a regular, if rare, ritual of human sacrifice. It's a debate that goes to the heart of how we see the Minoans. Were they a peaceful, enlightened people, or was there a dark, violent undercurrent to their society? The myth of the Minotaur, a story of a yearly human tribute, suddenly feels less like a myth and more like a terrifying echo of a terrible, forgotten truth. You stand in the quiet ruins, and the peaceful, almost artistic nature of the Minoan frescoes and pottery is in stark contrast to the dark possibility of human sacrifice. The air feels heavy, not with dust, but with the weight of a quiet, haunting question. Was the story of the Minotaur a Greek fantasy, or was it a historical memory of a dark and violent ritual that took place right here, in this peaceful, beautiful land? The answer is probably a mix of both, a horrifying truth that was transformed into a mythical monster. The myth, in a way, was a lot easier to swallow than the reality. The stillness of the ruins feels less like a quiet aftermath and more like a deep, long-held secret. The dark, quiet air of the archaeological site now feels different, charged with a new kind of power, a geologic one. We're still in the world of myth and history, but we're about to explore a far more spectacular and very boring explanation for the end of the Minoan civilization. You are no longer in the palace of Knossos, but on a different island. A small, volcanic caldera named Thera which is a few hundred miles north of Crete. The air here is clean and a little sharp, and the ground feels firm, but there is a strange, underlying tremor. We are looking for a historical event that may have been so catastrophic that it gave rise to the myths of the Minotaur and the demise of the Minoans. The mainstream historical fact here is the Minoan eruption, one of the largest volcanic explosions in human history, around 1600 BC. The volcano on the island of Thera erupted with the force of hundreds of atomic bombs. The eruption was so massive that it blew out the center of the island, creating the caldera you see today. The event sent a massive plume of ash and pumice high into the atmosphere, blocking out the sun and covering the entire region in a thick layer of dust. This was followed by a series of colossal tsunamis that would have devastated the coastal cities of Crete. The eruption didn't destroy the Minoan civilization in one fell swoop, but it was a cataclysmic event that would have crippled their naval power and agricultural production, making them vulnerable to invasion from their neighbors on the mainland. The eruption was a quiet, relentless enemy, a force of nature that outdid any monster or king. A quirky and very unboring tidbit about the eruption is that the Minoans may have had a kind of early warning system. The archaeologists found beautiful, vibrant frescoes in the city of Akrotiri on the island of Thera, which had been buried by the eruption. One of them, the Boxing Boys fresco, shows two young boys engaged in a ritualized fight, but in the background, you can see a large, dark plume of smoke rising from the volcano. The city was abandoned before the eruption, which suggests that the Minoans had felt a series of smaller tremors and had a sense that a catastrophe was coming. They didn't have a name for it, but they had a sense of an impending disaster. They had enough warning to evacuate the city, but they couldn't escape the long-term, devastating consequences. It's a sad, quiet detail that reminds you that even with a warning, some events are simply inescapable. Historians still argue whether the Thera eruption was the sole cause of the Minoan civilization's decline. Some scholars believe that the eruption was the final straw, a terrible event that came at a time when the Minoan civilization was already in a state of decay. Other scholars believe that the eruption was a catalyst, a kind of starting gun for the Mycenaean Greeks to invade and conquer Crete. The fact that the story of the Minotaur and the labyrinth has so much to do with the sea and with Crete's isolation suggests that the myth might be a folk memory of this very real, very terrifying event. Was the Minotaur a monster, or was it a personification of a terrifying force of nature? The air here feels cold and empty, a fitting monument to a civilization that was brought to its knees not by a hero, but by a mountain. The echo of the Thera eruption is fading now, and the quiet, geological forces of the past are giving way to something far more personal and visceral. You're leaving the world of kings and palaces and entering a world of heroes and monsters, but not the kind you've seen before. You are no longer in the dry, rocky world of Greece, but in the vast, empty expanse of the sea. The air smells of salt and old leather, and you are standing on a small, battered wooden ship, surrounded by a group of tired, weary sailors. You're looking out at a green, lush island that looks deserted, and the feeling in the air is less of dread and more of a quiet, weary optimism. You have just landed with Odysseus, the clever hero of the Trojan War, and you are about to encounter a new kind of monster, a much more solitary and frankly less dignified one, the Cyclops. The Cyclops, or rather the Cyclopes, were a race of giants who lived in caves and were known for their single, giant eye. They were not civilized, they were shepherds and farmers, but they were also cannibals who had no respect for the laws of hospitality that were so sacred to the ancient Greeks. This is the mainstream historical fact about them. They were an entire race of uncivilized, one-eyed giants. This is a far cry from the Minotaur, which was a singular, special monster. The Cyclopes were just a normal, boring part of the world, a kind of unevolved subspecies of humanity. It's a bit like seeing a species of giant, one-eyed Sasquatch. The story we are concerned with, however, is about a singular Cyclops named Polyphemus, the son of Poseidon. Odysseus and his men, desperate for food and water after a long, difficult voyage, landed on the island and, as was the custom, went to the nearest cave they could find to ask for hospitality. The cave, of course, belonged to Polyphemus, the monster instead of offering food and drink, simply rolled a giant stone over the entrance, trapping Odysseus and his men inside. He then proceeded to eat 2 of them for dinner. It's a classic example of a no good deed goes unpunished situation, a moment of profound, anti-heroic horror. The Cyclops wasn't a noble beast or a tragic figure. He was just a rude, hungry giant with terrible table manners, a quirky and very boring tidbit about the Cyclops is that he lived a remarkably isolated and in its own way peaceful life. He was a shepherd. He would take his flock of sheep out every morning and he would milk them every night. His cave was not a palace but a simple, rustic home, filled with cheeses and milk. The fact that this terrifying, man-eating monster was also a boring, hard-working dairy farmer is a delightful little detail. It humanizes him in a strange, unsettling way. You can almost see him, a giant, one-eyed shepherd, humming a tune as he milks his goats, completely oblivious to the fact that his life is about to be turned upside down by a very clever, very angry Greek. Historians still argue whether the Cyclops myth had a basis in a real, historical event. Some scholars believe that the story was a kind of allegory for the Greeks' encounter with a different, less civilized people. Others believe that the myth had a more physical basis. The island of Sicily, where the story is said to have taken place, is home to the fossilized remains of dwarf elephants, which had a single, large hole in the center of their foreheads for their trunk. It is possible that early Greek settlers, finding these strange, one-holed skulls, assumed they belonged to a race of one-eyed giants. The story of a monster, in this case, would have been a kind of terrifying, ancient attempt at paleontology. The air now feels tense, and the smell of the sea is replaced by a faint, unsettling scent of old cheese and raw meat, a prelude to a hero's most difficult and most boring test. The oppressive air of the Cyclops' cave is now filled with a quiet sense of tension and a strange, almost sickeningly sweet smell of wine. You're still trapped with Odysseus and his men, but the situation has shifted from one of passive horror to one of active and very methodical defiance. Odysseus, the master of trickery, has a plan. It is not a heroic plan of strength or battle, but a clever, cunning, and very boring plan of subterfuge. The Cyclops, Polyphemus, is now drunk. He has been given a kind of ancient party trick, a strong, unwatered wine, and he has fallen for it. The monster is now lying on the floor, in a drunken stupor, and the time for action is now. The mainstream historical fact about this part of the myth is the cleverness of Odysseus's trick. He didn't just give the Cyclops wine, he told the monster that his name was Nobody. He did this for a very specific and very boring reason. Once the Cyclops was asleep, Odysseus and his men took a giant, sharpened olive stake they had prepared earlier and drove it into the Cyclops' single eye. The monster woke up with a roar, screaming in pain. The other Cyclopes on the island heard his cries and came to the cave entrance to ask what was wrong. The Cyclops screamed, "Nobody is killing me." The other Cyclopes, hearing this, simply assumed he was fine and went away. The cleverness of the name Nobody was the key to their escape. It's a classic example of a hero winning not with his brawn but with his brains, a quirky and very gross tidbit about the blinding of the Cyclops is the detail of the stake. The stake was not just a stick, it was a giant, freshly cut olive tree branch that was still green. They had to heat it in the fire until it was blazing hot before they drove it into his eye. The sound, according to the poem, was like a blacksmith plunging a giant, hot piece of iron into cold water. The sizzle and the smell of the burning flesh must have been horrific. The ancient Greeks, for all their love of beauty and poetry, had a very visceral understanding of gore. It's a very unheroic and very disturbing detail that reminds you that even the most clever plans can be messy. Historians still argue whether the trick with the name Nobody was a part of the original myth or a later addition. Some scholars believe that the trick was a metaphorical representation of Odysseus's cunning and his ability to outsmart his enemies. Others believe it was a kind of ancient joke, a classic example of a hero using wordplay to save the day. The fact that the story has endured for so long is a testament to its genius. You are now standing in the quiet of the cave, the monster groaning in pain, and you feel the immense weight of the hero's task. The air smells of wine, blood, and a kind of terrible, triumphant relief. The monster is defeated, but the escape is still a long, slow, and very boring process. The dark, hot air of the Cyclops' cave has now been replaced by a cool, clean sea breeze. You are no longer on the ground, but on the soft, woolly back of a sheep. You are with Odysseus and his men, and you are about to escape the cave. But it is not a dramatic, heroic escape. It is a slow, methodical, and very boring process that relies on the dull, daily habits of a flock of sheep and the blindness of a very angry monster. The Cyclops has opened the cave to let his flock of sheep out for their daily grazing. He is standing at the entrance, his arms outstretched, feeling the back of each sheep as it passes, to make sure none of the men are escaping. The mainstream historical fact here is the ingenious and very simple method of their escape. Odysseus, the master of disguise and deception, has instructed his men to tie themselves to the undersides of the thick, shaggy, fleeced sheep. He himself, a larger man, has grabbed the biggest ram and tied himself to it. As the sheep pass out of the cave, the Cyclops feels their backs, but he doesn't feel the men underneath. It's a beautifully simple, almost comical plan. The hero who had won the Trojan War with a giant horse is now escaping a cave by clinging to the belly of a sheep. It's a quiet, unheroic moment, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most effective strategies are the simplest and most absurd, a quirky and very boring tidbit about the escape is the detail of the sheep themselves. The sheep were not just a means of escape, they were a source of tension. The Cyclops, as he feels the back of his ram, pauses for a moment. He feels the animal, and he feels its heart pounding. He talks to the ram, telling it that it's the last one to leave the cave, and he asks it if it's sad for its master. The fact that the Cyclops, a man-eating monster, has such a close, personal relationship with his sheep is a funny, and almost sad, detail. It makes him less of a monster and more of a lonely, simple-minded creature who has just had a very bad day. It's a kind of ancient pet owner story, a very boring moment of a hero hiding under a beloved animal. Historians still argue whether the escape from the Cyclops' cave was a metaphor for a kind of spiritual rebirth. Some scholars believe that the act of hiding under a sheep was a kind of symbolic return to a state of innocence, a kind of primal escape from the monster of chaos. Others believe it's just a good story, a simple, clever solution to a very simple problem. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The story is a testament to the fact that the most enduring myths are often a blend of simple heroism, clever ingenuity, and a few very boring and very quirky details. You are now a safe distance from the cave, and you can hear the furious, impotent roar of the Cyclops behind you. You have escaped, but the journey is far from over. The smell of the sea is back, and it feels like a kind of quiet, familiar comfort. The sea air is now a familiar and welcome sensation. You're on the ship, sailing away from the island of the Cyclops, but the story is far from over. The myth of the Cyclops, like so many Greek myths, is more than just a tale of a hero and a monster. It's a cautionary tale, a kind of moral lesson wrapped up in a thrilling adventure. You are no longer in the action of the myth, but in the quiet, reflective aftermath. You're looking back at the island, a small, dark speck on the horizon, and you're thinking about the meaning of it all. The mainstream historical fact here is that the Cyclops myth was a kind of ancient instruction manual for how to deal with outsiders. The Cyclopes were everything the Greeks were not. They were uncivilized, they had no regard for the laws of hospitality, and they lived in isolation. The Greeks, on the other hand, were a people who lived in a world of city-states and trade, a people who had a strong sense of community and a deep respect for the laws of hospitality. The myth of the Cyclops was a way for the Greeks to define themselves by what they were not. It was a story about the dangers of a world without rules, a world without community, and a world without a shared sense of humanity. It's a boring, but very important lesson. The Cyclops was a monster, yes, but he was also a symbol of a chaotic, dangerous world that the Greeks were trying to tame, a quirky and very unboring tidbit about the Cyclops myth is that it's also a story about the dangers of hubris. Remember how Odysseus, once he was safely on the ship, couldn't resist a final, taunting moment. He shouted to the Cyclops, revealing his real name and his father's name, and boasting about his cleverness. This was a massive mistake. The Cyclops, now knowing who had blinded him, prayed to his father, Poseidon, to curse Odysseus. This is the moment in the myth where the Cyclops, a symbol of brute force, becomes a vehicle for divine revenge. The rest of Odysseus's journey, a long and difficult one, is a direct result of this one. Single act of arrogance, the hero, in his moment of triumph, forgot the very lesson he was supposed to be teaching, that in a world of gods and monsters, humility is a far more powerful tool than pride. Historians still argue whether this final, hubristic moment was a part of the original myth or a later addition. Some scholars believe that the story of the curse was a way to explain the long, difficult journey that Odysseus had to endure on his way home. Others believe it was a kind of narrative device, a way to show that even a hero is subject to the whims of the gods. The truth, of course, is a mix of both. The myth is both a story about the dangers of the uncivilized world and a story about the dangers of human pride. You are now a safe distance from the island, and the sea is calm, but the quiet, enduring lesson of the Cyclops lingers in the air. The most dangerous monster in the story wasn't the one with one eye. It was the one who couldn't control his own arrogance. The ship is now sailing away from the island of the Cyclops, and the sea is calm. But the strange, unnerving feeling of that cave lingers. The story of the Cyclops is a myth, but it's a myth that has a very real, very boring, and very physical basis. You're no longer in the world of monsters and heroes, but in the world of stone and legend. You are now standing in front of a giant, ancient wall. A wall so impossibly massive that it looks like it was built by giants. The stones are huge, unmortared, and stacked in a way that seems to defy gravity. This is a Cyclopean wall, and its very existence is a testament to the fact that myths, however fantastical, often have their roots in a strange, historical reality. The mainstream historical fact about these walls is that they are real. They were built in the Mycenaean era, between 1600 and 1100 BC, and they were used to fortify cities like Mycenae and Tiryns. The stones were so large and so heavy that later Greeks, who had no memory of the civilization that built them, believed they were the work of the mythical Cyclopes. It's a beautifully simple and very boring piece of historical reasoning. The work was so far beyond their own capabilities that they attributed it to a mythical race of giants. The walls were a kind of ancient monument to a lost technology, a physical mystery that required a supernatural explanation. You can run your hand over the rough, cold stone and feel the weight of that forgotten history. It's a kind of quiet, physical proof of the power of myth. A quirky and very unboring tidbit about these walls is that they were not just a show of force, they were also a kind of early engineering marvel. The builders used a technique called ashlar masonry, where the stones were so carefully cut and so precisely fit together that they didn't need any mortar to hold them in place. The walls were designed to be both massive and flexible, able to withstand earthquakes and siege warfare. The fact that the walls were a marvel of both size and subtlety is a testament to the skill of their builders. The walls were not just big, they were clever. It's a kind of ancient secret, a hidden layer of engineering genius underneath the massive, brutish exterior. Historians still argue whether the myth of the Cyclops was created to explain the walls, or if the walls were named after an already existing myth. The truth is probably a little of both. The myths of giants and monsters were already a part of Greek folklore, but the discovery of these massive, unexplainable walls would have given the myth a new, physical dimension. The myth of the Cyclops became the perfect, and perfectly simple, explanation for a very boring and very complex historical reality. The walls are a kind of quiet, stone echo of a forgotten civilization. You stand in the shadow of the walls and you can feel the heavy weight of a history that is both real and imaginary at the same time. The stone, cold and ancient, feels less like a wall and more like a kind of physical memory. The cold, heavy air of the Cyclopean walls is now a distant memory, replaced by the thin, crisp air of the high mountains. You are no longer in a world of mortals and monsters, but in a world of gods and goddesses. You are beginning a long, arduous, and very boring ascent up a steep mountain path, your feet finding purchase on the rocky soil. The path is winding and difficult, but you are not alone. You are on your way to the home of the Greek pantheon, the most famous mountain in the world. You are on your way to Mount Olympus. The mainstream historical fact about Mount Olympus is that it is a real place. It is the highest mountain in Greece, a towering peak that often has its summit shrouded in clouds. This, of course, was a perfect place for the Greeks to put their gods. It was a place that was both a part of their world and apart from it, a kind of in-between space where the divine could exist without having to be bogged down by the mundane, boring parts of human life. The gods of Olympus were not some distant, abstract figures. They were a part of the Greek landscape. They lived on a real mountain, and they were a real, and very important, part of Greek life. The world of the gods was not a peaceful, harmonious place. It was a world of drama, jealousy, and revenge, a kind of ancient, dysfunctional family sitcom. The supreme ruler was Zeus, the king of the gods, a god of lightning and thunder who was also a serial philanderer. His wife, Hera, the goddess of marriage, was a fierce and often vengeful goddess who spent most of her time getting revenge on Zeus's many mistresses and their offspring. Then there was Poseidon, the god of the sea and earthquakes, and Hades, the god of the underworld, two of Zeus's brothers. The rest of the pantheon, from the beautiful Aphrodite, the goddess of love, to the brave Ares, the god of war, were all a part of this messy, divine family. A quirky and very unboring tidbit about the gods is that they were not just powerful, they were also a reflection of human nature. The gods were all powerful, yes, but they were also petty, jealous, and full of flaws. They had affairs, they fought with their families, and they were often cruel and vindictive. The Greeks, in their genius, had created a pantheon of gods that were a lot like themselves. The gods were not perfect, they were a kind of divine mirror of human nature. This made them relatable, a way for the Greeks to understand their own world, their own flaws, and their own nature. It's a very simple, but very profound idea. Historians still argue whether the myths of the gods were a kind of ancient entertainment or if they were a kind of moral instruction manual. Some scholars believe that the myths were a way for the Greeks to grapple with the big, unanswerable questions of life and death, love and war. Others believe they were just a good story, a kind of ancient blockbuster movie. The truth is probably a bit of both. The gods were a source of great drama and great entertainment, but they were also a source of great wisdom. You are now standing on a high, windy pass, and the clouds are parting, revealing the impossibly high peak of Mount Olympus. The air is cold and thin, and you can feel the quiet, awesome power of the gods. The mountain feels less like a rock and more like a kind of living, breathing, and very dangerous thing. The thin, cold air of Mount Olympus is now filled with the sound of laughter, shouting, and the occasional burst of thunder. You are not in a quiet, serene space, but in a bustling, chaotic court. You are in the home of the Greek gods, and you are witnessing their daily and very boring family drama. At the center of it all is Zeus, the king of the gods, sitting on a massive, golden throne. He is not a kind, benevolent ruler, but a frustrated, and often angry, patriarch who is constantly trying to keep his chaotic family in line. The mainstream historical fact here is the profound, and very boring, dysfunction of the divine family. Zeus, for all his power, was a deeply flawed character. He was married to Hera, the goddess of marriage, but he was constantly having affairs with other goddesses, nymphs, and even mortal women. Hera, in turn, was a master of vengeance. She would torment Zeus's lovers and their offspring, often in creative and horrifying ways. It was a kind of endless, divine soap opera, a cycle of betrayal, anger, and revenge. The gods were a reflection of human nature, yes, but they were a reflection of the most difficult and most flawed parts of it. Their lives were a kind of cautionary tale, a very boring and very relatable example of how even the most powerful family can be a total mess, a quirky and very unboring. Tidbit about the gods is the story of how they were all born. Zeus, as a baby, was hidden from his father, Cronus, who had a nasty habit of eating his children to prevent them from overthrowing him. Zeus was raised in secret, and once he was an adult, he tricked Cronus into drinking a potion that made him vomit up his siblings. The gods were born not from some glorious, pristine birth, but from a kind of divine regurgitation. It's a very unheroic and very gross detail that reminds you that even the most powerful gods have a very undignified origin. It's a kind of divine origin story that feels less like a myth and more like a strange and very uncomfortable family reunion. Historians still argue whether the family drama of the gods was a kind of ancient therapy or a simple reflection of the Greek world. Some scholars believe that the gods' flaws were a way for the Greeks to grapple with their own. The gods were an externalization of their own anger, jealousy, and fear. Others believe that the stories of the gods were a kind of social commentary, a way for the Greeks to poke fun at their own powerful and often corrupt rulers. The truth is probably a mix of both. The gods were a source of great drama, but they were also a source of great wisdom. The air on Olympus is now a little quieter, and the gods are sitting on their thrones, arguing about who gets to have the last word. You can almost feel the weight of their long, tedious, and very human family drama. The mountain feels less like a home and more like a cage. The chaos of the divine family is momentarily quieted by a strange and very undivine sound, a terrible, God-sized headache. You are now witnessing one of the most famous and most boring births in all of Greek mythology. Zeus is sitting on his throne, clutching his head in agony, his face contorted in pain. This isn't the drama of a family fight or a revenge plot. It's the simple, physical agony of a headache so bad it could tear a god apart. The other gods are gathered around, concerned but also a little bored, as if this happens all the time. Which, to be fair, it probably did. The mainstream historical fact about this event is the unusual birth of Athena. Zeus had swallowed his first wife, Metis, who was pregnant at the time, because he was afraid of a prophecy that their child would be stronger than he was and would overthrow him. But Metis and her unborn child were still inside him, and they were giving him a splitting headache. The pain was so intense that he finally asked his son, Hephaestus, the god of the forge, to split his head open with an axe. Hephaestus, a dutiful but probably bored son, did so, and from Zeus's head, fully grown, and fully armed with a spear and a shield, sprang the goddess Athena. It's a very undignified birth for a goddess of wisdom and war, a kind of mythological C-section performed with a god-sized axe, a quirky and very boring tidbit about the birth is the detail of her armour. Athena was not born naked or as a child, she was born in full battle gear. She sprang from Zeus's head with a battle cry, and her birth shook the heavens. The fact that she was born ready for war is a very specific and very boring detail that tells you a lot about her nature. She wasn't just a goddess of wisdom, she was also a goddess of strategic war. She was a planner, a schemer, and a tactician, and her birth was a kind of a preview of her personality. She was born ready for a fight. Historians still argue whether the story of Athena's birth was a metaphor for the birth of a new kind of wisdom, one that was born not from the womb but from the mind. Some scholars believe that the story was a kind of ancient allegory for the idea of a new kind of knowledge, one that was born from logic and reason rather than from a physical, emotional process. Others believe it's just a good story, a bizarre and memorable way to explain the origin of a powerful goddess. The truth, of course, is probably a mix of both. The myth is both a metaphor and a story, a kind of divine origin story that is both weird and profound. You stand on the edge of the crowd of gods, and you can almost feel the quiet, dignified presence of Athena, a goddess who was born not from a goddess, but from a headache. The air is now a little clearer, and a little colder, and the drama has been replaced by a quiet, and very strange, sense of awe. The bizarre birth of Athena is now a distant, and very undignified, memory. You are now standing in the quiet and very boring corridors of Olympus. But you are not looking at the famous first-tier gods. You are looking at the second tier, the demigods and the minor gods, the forgotten children of Zeus. The air is a bit more relaxed here, a little less dramatic and a lot more human. You're getting a sense of the sheer scale of the divine family, a family so large and so chaotic that it has its own, very boring, backstage drama. The mainstream historical fact here is the existence of the demigods, the half-human, half-divine children of the gods. The most famous, of course, are heroes like Heracles, the son of Zeus, who performed 12 impossible labors, and Perseus, who killed Medusa. But there were countless others, from minor river gods to obscure nymphs. The gods, as you now know, were a very amorous bunch, and they had a lot of children with mortals. This created a huge, and very boring, class of divine offspring who were not quite gods but not quite human. They were a kind of in-between species, a living, breathing testament to the promiscuous nature of the gods. Their lives were often a mix of great power and great tragedy, a constant battle between their divine heritage and their human nature, a quirky and very unboring tidbit about the demigods is the story of Pan, the goat-footed god of the wild. He was a son of Hermes, the messenger god, and he was known for his love of music and his love of chasing nymphs. But he was also known for his terrible, sudden rages. The word panic comes from his name, a kind of quiet, irrational fear that would suddenly seize a person in the middle of a peaceful field. Pan was a god of nature, a kind of embodiment of the quiet, and very unsettling, forces of the wild. He was a god of both peace and terror, a kind of living contradiction. The fact that the god of a peaceful field could also be the god of a terrible, sudden fear is a very Greek idea. The gods were not simple figures, they were a mix of good and bad, of peace and terror. Historians still argue whether the stories of the demigods were a kind of ancient attempt at explaining why some people were so special. Some scholars believe that the demigods were a kind of ancient superhero story, a way for the Greeks to explain the existence of powerful, charismatic leaders and warriors. Others believe that the myths of the demigods were a kind of ancient folk memory, a way to explain the existence of a special and very old class of people. The truth, of course, is a mix of both. The demigods were both a kind of ancient hero and a kind of ancient folk memory. You are now standing in a quiet corner of Olympus, and you can feel the heavy and very boring weight of a long and very complicated family tree. The gods were not a simple family, they were a vast, chaotic, and very human thing. The quiet drama of the demigods is now a distant memory, replaced by a deep and very profound sense of sadness. The air is no longer thin and cold, but heavy and still, and it smells of death and decay. You are no longer on Olympus, but in the dark, sunless world of the underworld. You are following a man of great beauty and even greater talent, who is on a mission of love. This is Orpheus, the legendary musician, and he is on his way to rescue his wife, Eurydice, who has just died from a snakebite. His story is one of the most famous and most boringly tragic in all of Greek mythology. The mainstream historical fact here is the power of Orpheus's music. He was the son of Apollo, and his music was so beautiful, so enchanting, that it could charm beasts, move stones, and even calm the angry sea. In his journey to the underworld, he uses his music not just as a tool but as a kind of magical passport. He plays his lyre, and the three-headed dog, Cerberus, falls asleep. He plays, and the terrible ferryman, Charon, agrees to take him across the river Styx. He even plays for Hades, the king of the underworld, and his wife, Persephone. And his music moves them so deeply that they agree to let him take Eurydice back to the land of the living. It's a beautifully simple and very powerful idea that the power of art can overcome the power of death. A quirky and very unboring tidbit about Orpheus's music is that it was also used to silence a particularly loud and very annoying group of women. The sirens, as you may recall, were half women half-bird creatures who would lure sailors to their deaths with their beautiful, but deceptive, songs. Orpheus was a part of the Argonauts, a group of heroes who went on a quest for the Golden Fleece. As they sailed past the Sirens' Island, Orpheus, a master of song, played his lyre so beautifully that his music drowned out the sirens' songs, saving his fellow sailors from a terrible fate. The fact that the same man who used his music to defeat death also used it to defeat a very loud group of women is a very Greek detail. The gods and heroes were not just powerful, they were also very practical. Historians still argue whether the story of Orpheus and Eurydice was a kind of ancient mystery religion or a simple cautionary tale. Some scholars believe that the story of Orpheus's journey to the underworld was a kind of a spiritual guide, a map for a person's own journey through death. Others believe it's just a good story, a tragic tale of a hero who fails at the very last moment. The truth, of course, is a mix of both. The myth is both a spiritual guide and a tragic tale. You are now standing in the quiet, sad world of the underworld, and you can feel the quiet, and very boring weight of a love that is about to be tested. The air is still and silent, and the only sound is the quiet, and very sad. Music of a hero's heart, the quiet, sad world of the underworld is now a little less sad and a lot more boring, as you are about to learn the rules. Orpheus has just made his case to Hades and Persephone, and they have agreed to let him take Eurydice back to the land of the living. But there's a catch. The underworld, as you are about to discover, is not a place of chaos and whimsy, it is a place of very boring and very strict rules. The gods of the underworld are not like the gods on Olympus. They are methodical, patient, and very, very serious. The mainstream historical fact here is the one, single, and very simple rule that Hades gives to Orpheus. He can take Eurydice back, but he must not look back at her until they are both safely in the upper world. It's a beautifully simple and very frustrating rule. It's a test of faith, of trust, and of patience. Orpheus, in his love for Eurydice, has to walk for what feels like an eternity, hearing her footsteps behind him but unable to turn and see her. It's a kind of ancient blindfolded trust fall. The drama of the myth is not in the grand quest to the underworld, but in this final, boring, and very difficult task. The fate of their love hangs on a single, and very simple, action, a quirky, and very unboring tidbit about the rules of the underworld is that they were often tied to a kind of psychological punishment. The gods of the underworld, as you will soon see, were masters of a kind of eternal, psychological torment. They didn't just punish people with physical pain, they punished them with a kind of endless and very boring task that was a reflection of their own crimes. The rules were a kind of cruel and very subtle joke. The underworld was not a place of fire and brimstone, it was a place of quiet and very repetitive torture. Historians still argue whether the story of Orpheus looking back at Eurydice was a metaphor for the fragility of love or if it was a simple and very human mistake. Some scholars believe that the story was a way for the Greeks to grapple with the idea that some things, once lost, can never truly be regained. Others believe it was just a good story, a tragic ending that was meant to teach a lesson about the dangers of impatience. The truth, of course, is a mix of both. The myth is both a metaphor and a story, a kind of divine test that is both simple and profound. You are now a safe distance from the gods, and you can feel the quiet and very boring weight of a long and very difficult walk. The air is still and silent, and the only sound is the quiet and very sad footsteps of a hero who is about to make a terrible and very human mistake. The quiet, sad air of the underworld now feels a little more tense, a little more dramatic. You are no longer with Orpheus, but with a man who is standing in a pool of water, a man whose punishment is a kind of cruel and very boring masterpiece of psychological torment. This is Tantalus, a man who, in his own time, was a very rich and very powerful king. His story is a classic and very boring example of a divine punishment that is a kind of terrible and very subtle joke. The mainstream historical fact here is the reason for his punishment Tantalus, for all his power and wealth, was a bit of a show-off. He was a favourite of the gods, and he was often invited to their feasts, but he, in a moment of hubris, decided to test the gods' omniscience. He slaughtered his own son, Pelops, and served him to the gods in a stew. He wanted to see if they would know what they were eating. The gods, of course, knew. Demeter, distracted by the loss of her daughter, Persephone, was the only one who took a bite of the shoulder. The gods, in their disgust and fury, punished Tantalus with a kind of eternal and very boring punishment, a quirky and very unboring tidbit about Tantalus's punishment is the detail of its cruelty. He was placed in a pool of water with a fruit tree hanging over his head, but the water would recede every time he bent down to drink, and the branches would lift every time he reached for a piece of fruit. He was in a state of eternal and very boring hunger and thirst. The word tantalize comes from his name, a kind of quiet and very frustrating psychological torment. The punishment was not a physical one, it was a mental one. He was forced to suffer not from the lack of food and water, but from the constant and very boring promise of it. It's a beautifully simple and very cruel kind of torture. Historians still argue whether the story of Tantalus was a cautionary tale about the dangers of human hubris, or if it was a kind of ancient explanation for a very boring and very real phenomenon. Some scholars believe that the story was a way for the Greeks to grapple with the idea that some things, even for the most powerful, are simply out of reach. Others believe it's just a good story, a tragic tale of a man who got what he deserved. The truth, of course, is a mix of both. The myth is both a cautionary tale and a story, a kind of divine punishment that is both simple and profound. You are now standing in the quiet, sad world of the underworld, and you can feel the quiet and very boring weight of a punishment that is a kind of cruel and very subtle joke. The air is still and silent, and the only sound is the quiet and very sad footsteps of a man who is forever reaching for something he can never have. The quiet, cruel world of the underworld is now a little more active, a little more noisy. You are no longer with Tantalus, but with a man who is engaged in a kind of endless and very boring physical labour. This is Sisyphus, a king who, in his own time, was known for his cleverness and his cunning. His story is a classic and very boring example of a divine punishment that is a kind of endless and very repetitive task. The mainstream historical fact here is the reason for his punishment. Sisyphus, for all his cleverness, was a bit of a trickster. He was known for his love of money and his love of power, and he often used his cunning to get what he wanted. He even managed to cheat death twice. The first time, he tricked the god of death, Thanatos, and put him in chains so no one could die. The second time, he tricked Persephone, the queen of the underworld, and managed to escape. The gods, in their fury, decided to punish him with a kind of eternal and very boring task. A quirky and very unboring tidbit about Sisyphus's punishment is the detail of its futility. He was condemned to roll a giant boulder up a hill, only for it to roll back down again every time he reached the top. The punishment was not a physical one, it was a mental one. He was forced to engage in a kind of endless and very boring labour that had no end and no meaning. The punishment was a kind of cruel and very subtle joke. It was a punishment that was a perfect reflection of his own life, a life of endless and very frustrating cunning that had no purpose and no meaning. Historians still argue whether the story of Sisyphus was a cautionary tale about the dangers of human pride, or if it was a kind of ancient explanation for a very boring and very real phenomenon. Some scholars believe that the story was a way for the Greeks to grapple with the idea that some things in life are simply pointless. Others believe it's just a good story, a tragic tale of a man who got what he deserved. The truth, of course, is a mix of both. The myth is both a cautionary tale and a story, a kind of divine punishment that is both simple and profound. You are now standing in the quiet, sad world of the underworld, and you can feel the quiet and very boring weight of a punishment that is a kind of cruel and very subtle joke. The air is still and silent, and the only sound is the quiet and very sad sound of a boulder rolling down a hill. The quiet, monotonous torment of Tantalus and Sisyphus is now a distant echo, replaced by a quiet, rhythmic lapping sound. You are no longer in a place of punishment, but in a kind of waiting room, a place of profound and very boring transition. You are standing on the banks of a dark, slow-moving river, a river that feels less like a river and more like a kind of fluid border. This is the river Styx, the most famous river in all of Greek mythology, and it is the river that separates the world of the living from the world of the dead. The mainstream historical fact here is the role of the river as a boundary. The Greeks believed that the river was a kind of physical and spiritual barrier that no one could cross without the help of a very specific and very boring kind of boatman. The river was a kind of a final and very official separation. Once you crossed the river, you could not go back. It was a kind of point of no return. The river was a symbol of the finality of death, a kind of quiet and very profound goodbye. A quirky and very unboring tidbit about the river is the detail of its name. The word Styx comes from the Greek word for hate or abhorrence. The river was a kind of living, breathing embodiment of a terrible promise. The gods, as you now know, were a bit of a chaotic bunch, but they took their promises very seriously. If a god swore an oath on the river Styx, they had to keep it, no matter what. The river was a kind of divine contract, a very boring and very official agreement. The fact that the most sacred river in all of Greek mythology was a kind of living, breathing embodiment of a terrible promise is a very Greek idea. The gods were not just powerful, they were also very serious. Historians still argue whether the river Styx was a real place or a simple metaphor for death. Some scholars believe that the river was a kind of ancient folk memory of a real, physical river that the Greeks had to cross to get to their final resting place. Others believe it's just a good story, a tragic tale of a final and very official goodbye. The truth, of course, is a mix of both. The myth is both a metaphor and a story, a kind of divine punishment that is both simple and profound. You are now standing on the quiet, sad banks of the river, and you can feel the quiet and very boring weight of a journey that has no return. The air is still and silent, and the only sound is the quiet and very sad lapping of the water. The quiet, dark waters of the river Styx are now a little less quiet. You're no longer alone on the banks, but in a long, silent line of dead souls, all waiting to get on a small, battered boat. The air smells of damp earth and river water, and the feeling is less of fear and more of a profound and very boring resignation. You are about to meet the most famous and most notoriously grumpy ferryman in all of Greek mythology. This is Charon, the old boatman who ferries the souls of the dead across the river to the underworld. The mainstream historical fact here is the role of Charon as the gatekeeper of the underworld. He was not a god, but a kind of divine functionary, a kind of ancient bus driver who was just doing his job. He was a very serious and very grumpy old man, and he had a very simple and very strict rule. He would only take you if you had the fare. The fare was a single coin, an obol, which was placed under the tongue of the dead person before they were buried. If you didn't have the coin, you were left on the banks of the river for 100 years, unable to cross. The Greeks, in their genius, had created a system that was both a spiritual passage and a very boring and very physical transaction, a quirky and very unboring tidbit about the coin is the detail of its placement. The obol was placed under the tongue of the dead person, a very specific and very physical act. It was a kind of final and very official payment. The act was a way for the Greeks to ensure that the dead person had a proper burial and that they would have a peaceful transition to the afterlife. The coin was a kind of a ticket, a kind of a final and very practical goodbye. The fact that the most spiritual journey of a person's life was dependent on a single and very boring piece of currency is a very Greek idea. The gods were not just powerful, they were also very practical. Historians still argue whether the story of Charon and the obol was a kind of ancient explanation for a very boring and very real phenomenon. Some scholars believe that the myth was a way for the Greeks to grapple with the idea that some things, even in death, have a price. Others believe it's just a good story, a tragic tale of a final and very official goodbye. The truth, of course, is a mix of both. The myth is both a metaphor and a story, a kind of divine punishment that is both simple and profound. You are now a safe distance from the boat, and you can feel the quiet and very boring weight of a journey that has no return. The air is still and silent, and the only sound is the quiet and very sad footsteps of a man who is forever waiting for a ride. The quiet, sad world of the underworld is now a distant memory, replaced by the chaotic and very boring sounds of a massive war. The air is no longer still and silent, but filled with the sounds of marching armies, clanging swords, and the quiet, nervous energy of 1,000 men waiting for a fight. You are no longer in a world of gods and monsters, but in a world of mortals and heroes, and you are standing in front of a giant, ancient city, a city so famous that it has become a kind of living legend. You are in front of the city of Troy, and you are at the beginning of the most famous and most boring war in all of Greek mythology. The mainstream historical fact here is the reason for the Trojan War. It was not a grand, heroic conflict, but a very simple and very human drama. The war was sparked by a single and very boring event, the abduction of a beautiful woman. Helen, the wife of the Spartan king Menelaus, was abducted by a Trojan prince. Paris, Menelaus, in a rage, called upon all the Greek kings and heroes to help him get his wife back. The war was not a war of conquest or of political power. It was a war of honor, a war that was fought over a single and very beautiful woman. A quirky and very unboring tidbit about the war is the detail of a golden apple. The story begins with a divine wedding, a wedding of a sea goddess and a mortal king. All the gods were invited, except for Eris, the goddess of discord. In a fit of rage, she threw a golden apple into the crowd of gods, a golden apple that was inscribed with the words, "To the fairest." 3 goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, all claimed the apple. Zeus, in a very wise move, chose a mortal man, Paris, to be the judge. The 3 goddesses, in a kind of ancient beauty pageant, all tried to bribe him. Hera promised him power, Athena promised him wisdom, and Aphrodite promised him the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen. Paris, of course, chose Aphrodite, and he was rewarded with Helen's love, a love that would lead to a terrible and very boring war. The war was not just a war of honor, it was a kind of divine beauty contest. Historians still argue whether the Trojan War was a real, historical event or a simple metaphor for a very boring and very real conflict. Some scholars believe that the war was a kind of ancient explanation for the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization. Others believe it's just a good story, a tragic tale of a final and very brutal goodbye. The truth, of course, is a mix of both. The myth is both a metaphor and a story, a kind of divine punishment that is both simple and profound. You are now a safe distance from the city, and you can feel the quiet and very boring weight of a long and very difficult siege. The air is still and silent, and the only sound is the quiet and very sad footsteps of 1,000 men. The boring, long drawn-out siege of Troy is now in full swing. The air is filled with the sounds of battle, the clang of swords, and the shouts of angry men. But the war itself is not the focus of this moment. The focus is on a single and very unboring face. A face so beautiful that it launched 1,000 ships. The story of Helen of Troy is a classic and very boring example of a human drama that has a grand and very unhuman consequence. The mainstream historical fact here is the power of Helen's beauty. She was the most beautiful woman in the world, a kind of living, breathing embodiment of divine beauty. She was not just a woman, she was a symbol, a kind of living, breathing prize. Her beauty was so profound that when the Trojan elders saw her, they said that it was no wonder that so many men had come to fight for her. She was a kind of living justification for a terrible and very brutal war, a quirky and very unboring tidbit about Helen is the detail of her birth. She was not a mortal woman, but a daughter of Zeus, who, in the form of a swan, seduced her mother, Leda. She was born from an egg, a kind of divine and very undignified birth. She was a kind of living, breathing testament to the promiscuous nature of the gods. The fact that the most famous woman in all of Greek mythology was born from a swan-god liaison is a very Greek idea. The gods were not just powerful, they were also very strange. Historians still argue whether Helen was a real person or a simple metaphor for a very boring and very real conflict. Some scholars believe that the myth of Helen was a way for the Greeks to grapple with the idea that some things, even for the most powerful, are simply out of reach. Others believe it's just a good story, a tragic tale of a final and very brutal goodbye. The truth, of course, is a mix of both. The myth is both a metaphor and a story, a kind of divine punishment that is both simple and profound. You are now a safe distance from the city, and you can feel the quiet and very boring weight of a long and very difficult siege. The air is still and silent, and the only sound is the quiet and very sad footsteps of 1,000 men. The long, boring siege of Troy is now at an end. The city has held out for 10 years, but the Greeks, in a moment of utter desperation, have come up with a plan. It is not a plan of strength or of battle, but a clever and very boring plan of subterfuge. The air is still and silent, and you are standing in front of a giant and very strange gift, a wooden horse, a horse so massive that it seems to defy gravity. The mainstream historical fact here is the detail of the wooden horse. It was a kind of Trojan horse, a kind of ancient gift that was, in reality, a very simple and very clever weapon. The Greeks had built a giant, hollow wooden horse, and they had filled it with their best soldiers. They then pretended to sail away, leaving the horse as a kind of peace offering. The Trojans, in a moment of utter hubris, brought the horse into their city, celebrating their victory, but at night, the soldiers emerged from the horse, opened the gates, and let the rest of the Greek army in. The city was sacked and burned, and the war was finally over. The horse was not just a gift, it was a kind of final and very clever trick, a quirky and very unboring tidbit about the horse is the detail of its construction. The horse was built by a man named Epeius, a master carpenter. The horse was not a simple wooden animal, but a kind of a work of art, a beautifully crafted and very undignified weapon. The fact that the most famous war in all of Greek mythology was won not with a sword or a shield, but with a giant and very boring wooden animal is a very Greek idea. The gods were not just powerful, they were also very strange. Historians still argue whether the story of the Trojan horse was a real historical event or a simple metaphor for a very boring and very real conflict. Some scholars believe that the story was a kind of ancient explanation for the fall of the city. Others believe it's just a good story, a tragic tale of a final and very brutal goodbye. The truth, of course, is a mix of both. The myth is both a metaphor and a story, a kind of divine punishment that is both simple and profound. You are now a safe distance from the city, and you can feel the quiet and very boring weight of a long and very difficult siege. The air is still and silent, and the only sound is the quiet and very sad footsteps of 1,000 men. The quiet, unheroic victory of the Trojan horse is now a distant echo. The city of Troy is in ruins, its walls shattered, its people scattered. The myth, of course, has a happy or at least a semi-happy, ending for the Greeks. But what of the reality? Was the Trojan War a real, historical event? Or was it just a story? You are no longer in the world of myth, but in a world of dusty archaeology and a very undramatic and very unheroic excavation. You are standing in front of a series of ancient ruins, a series of 10 different cities, all built on top of each other. This is Hisarlik, in modern-day Turkey, and it is the site of the real Troy. The mainstream historical fact here is the discovery of the archaeological site. In the 19th century, a German archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann, a man who was obsessed with the stories of Homer, decided to find the real city of Troy. He found a hill, a small, unassuming hill in modern-day Turkey, and he started to dig. He found not one city, but 10, all built on top of each other. He found a city that had been destroyed by fire, a city that was a perfect and very boring match for the story of Troy. He had found the real Troy, a quirky and very unboring tidbit about Schliemann is the detail of his methods. He was not a trained archaeologist but a kind of amateur, and a very impatient one. He dug a giant trench right through the middle of the site, destroying a lot of the archaeological evidence in his haste. He was in such a hurry to find the Troy of Homer that he didn't even bother to excavate the site properly. He was a kind of a treasure hunter, a man who was more interested in finding a grand, heroic city than in finding a boring and very real one. He even found a collection of jewelry, which he believed belonged to Helen, and he smuggled it out of the country. Historians still argue whether Schliemann's Troy was the real Troy of Homer. Some scholars believe that the city he found was too small and too unimpressive to be the city of the myth. Others believe that the myth was an exaggeration of a very simple and very boring conflict. The truth, of course, is a mix of both. The myth is both a metaphor and a story, a kind of divine punishment that is both simple and profound. You are now a safe distance from the city, and you can feel the quiet and very boring weight of a long and very difficult siege. The air is still and silent, and the only sound is the quiet and very sad footsteps of 1,000 men. The dusty ruins of the real Troy are now a distant echo. The Trojan War, a war that was fought over a beautiful woman, a war that was won with a clever and very boring trick, is now at an end. But what of the soldiers who fought in it? What of the weapons they used, the tactics they employed? You are no longer in the world of myth, but in a world of very simple and very boring military history. You are standing in front of a series of ancient weapons, a series of bronze swords, wooden shields, and a very simple and very effective kind of siege weapon. The mainstream historical fact here is the simplicity of ancient siege tactics. The Greeks did not have the grand, complicated siege machines of the later Roman Empire. They had something much simpler and much more boring. They had a wooden siege tower, a giant, mobile tower that they would roll up to the city walls and use to climb over them. The tower was not a work of art, but a kind of a simple and very effective kind of ladder. It was a kind of ancient and very boring piece of military hardware. The Trojan War, for all its drama, was a very simple and very brutal war, a quirky and very unboring tidbit about ancient siege tactics is the detail of scaling ladders. The Greeks would often use simple wooden ladders to climb over the city walls. This was a very dangerous and very unheroic way to fight a war. The men who climbed the ladders were often killed by the Trojans, who would simply push the ladders over or shoot them with arrows. The fact that the most famous war in all of Greek mythology was fought with simple and very boring tools is a very Greek idea. The gods were not just powerful, they were also very practical. Historians still argue whether the simplicity of ancient siege tactics was a sign of a lack of a unified military command, or if it was a kind of ancient form of military genius. Some scholars believe that the Greeks were simply too disorganized to come up with a better plan. Others believe that the simplicity of the tools was a kind of a secret weapon, a way for the Greeks to use their cunning to win a war that they could not win with brute force. The truth, of course, is a mix of both. The Trojan War is both a metaphor and a story, a kind of divine punishment that is both simple and profound. You are now a safe distance from the city, and you can feel the quiet and very boring weight of a long and very difficult siege. The air is still and silent, and the only sound is the quiet and very sad footsteps of 1,000 men. The dust of Troy is now settling, and the sounds of war have faded into a quiet, almost melancholic hum. You've journeyed through the great library of Alexandria, listened to the prophecies of Delphi, and walked through the ruins of Knossos and Troy. You've met monsters and heroes, gods and kings. The journey has been long, and in its own way, very boring. But as the final notes of our story fade, you realize that the most important thing about these myths is not the battles they describe or the kings they glorify, but their enduring term and very quiet power. They are the stories that we tell ourselves, the stories that shape our understanding of the world. They are the fading echo of a world that is both real and imaginary, a world that is both simple and profound. The mainstream historical fact here is the enduring power of myth. These stories, which were told by a culture that lived thousands of years ago, are still a part of our lives. We still talk about the wisdom of the oracle, the beauty of Helen, and the cunning of Odysseus. We still use words like labyrinthine and tantalize and Herculean, words that are a kind of living, breathing testament to the power of these old, boring stories. The myths are a kind of a language, a way for us to talk about the big, unanswerable questions of life and death, love and war. They are a kind of a living, breathing part of our history, a part of us that is both very old and very new, a quirky and very unboring tidbit about the power of myth is the detail of its survival. These stories, which were passed down from generation to generation, were not written down for a long, long time. They were sung and they were told, and they were a kind of a living, breathing part of a culture. They were a kind of a shared memory, a kind of a living, breathing book that was passed down from a father to a son, from a mother to a daughter. The fact that these stories, which were not written down for a very long time, have survived for so long is a testament to their enduring power. They are a kind of a living, breathing memory, a memory that is both simple and profound. Historians still argue whether the myths are a kind of a historical record or a simple and very unboring story. Some scholars believe that the myths are a kind of a folk memory, a way for the Greeks to remember the real and very violent events of their past. Others believe they're just a good story, a tragic tale of a final and very brutal goodbye. The truth, of course, is a mix of both. The myths are both a historical record and a story, a kind of divine punishment that is both simple and profound. You are now a safe distance from the past, and you can feel the quiet and very boring weight of a long and very difficult journey. The world feels so very quiet now. The sounds of battle and the hum of 1,000 voices have faded to a soft hush. The ghosts of libraries, oracles, and heroes are settling down, their stories now complete. The journey is over, and as the last vestiges of these ancient tales recede, you can finally feel the profound and very welcome stillness. The hum of your fan is a gentle presence. The dim light of the lamp is a soft comfort. The stories, so full of noise and chaos, have led you to this place of perfect quiet. The history we've explored wasn't just about empires and gods. It was about the slow, steady rhythm of time itself, the gentle decay of things, and the soft whisper of memory. You can let go now. Let the last bits of the story drift away like smoke on the wind. There's nothing left to do now but to close your eyes and sink into the peaceful silence. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.